She shouldn't have tried to take them. If I can't have them, no one can.
Silence! The jury has already found you guilty and has recommended the penalty of death. It is the judgment of this court.
On the afternoon of February 23, 2022, in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Kansas City, Missouri, an unimaginable horror unfolded behind the closed doors of a modest two-story home on Maple Street. Melissa Rycroft, a beloved 32-year-old elementary school teacher, and her two daughters, 7-year-old Faith and 4-year-old Sarah, were found brutally stabbed to death in what prosecutors would later describe as one of the most savage crime scenes they had ever witnessed. The responding officers, hardened by years on the force, struggled to maintain their composure as they documented the bloody aftermath: multiple stab wounds on each victim, defensive wounds on Melissa's arms and hands, indicating she had fought desperately to protect herself and possibly her children. The most shocking aspect of this heinous crime wasn't just its brutality, but the identity of the person who would eventually be charged: 78-year-old Cameron Bailey, the grandmother of the two young victims and mother-in-law to Melissa. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you're enjoying this true crime analysis, please consider subscribing to support our in-depth investigations into cases like this one. The story of Cameron Bailey would become one of the most disturbing examples of family violence in Missouri's recent history, challenging perceptions about elderly perpetrators and exposing the dangerous undercurrents that can flow beneath seemingly normal family dynamics. Detective Mason Mitchell, who had been with the Kansas City Police Department for 15 years, arrived at the scene at 5:10 p.m., responding to what dispatch had described as a multiple homicide reported by a family member. His body camera footage, which would later become crucial evidence in court, captured his initial conversation with Cameron Bailey, who sat wrapped in a shock blanket on the front porch, her hands trembling as she sipped from a paper cup of water provided by paramedics. "I just came by to drop off some cookies I baked for the girls," Cameron told Detective Mitchell, her voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances, her eyes not meeting his as she spoke. "I knocked, but no one answered, so I used my key. Derek always wanted me to have access in case of emergencies, and when I walked in, I found them. I found them like that." The detective's training immediately triggered subtle alarms. The elderly woman's affect seemed incongruent with someone who had just discovered her family brutally murdered, her clinical description lacking the emotional devastation such a discovery would typically elicit. Neighbors had already gathered behind the police tape, whispering among themselves, several mentioning to officers that Cameron and Melissa had a strained relationship, with one neighbor, Janet Collins, stating she had overheard heated arguments between the two women on multiple occasions. As crime scene technicians processed the house, Detective Mitchell received a call from his partner who had been canvassing the neighborhood, discovering that the home directly across the street had a doorbell camera with a clear view of the Mitchell residence. The footage would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It clearly showed Cameron Bailey arriving at the house at 4:05 p.m., 10 minutes before Melissa returned home with her daughters, and contradicted Cameron's statement that she had discovered the bodies when arriving at 4:50 p.m. When confronted with this discrepancy later that evening at the police station, Cameron's demeanor changed dramatically. The trembling, shocked grandmother was replaced by a defensive, argumentative woman who claimed the camera must be wrong, that she had been at the grocery store until just before calling 911. Her alibi quickly fell apart when store security footage showed her leaving the supermarket at 3:30 p.m., giving her ample time to reach the Mitchell home by the timestamp on the doorbell camera. The investigation gained momentum as detectives uncovered the volatile family dynamics that had been building for months. Derek Mitchell, 34, Cameron's son and Melissa's husband, was working at a construction site when the murders occurred, his alibi confirmed by dozens of co-workers and his foreman. When notified about the deaths of his wife and daughters, Derek collapsed at the work site, requiring medical attention before detectives could interview him. His devastation appeared genuine to investigators, who initially considered him a potential suspect, until his alibi proved unshakable. Text messages recovered from Melissa's phone painted a troubling picture. She had been planning to leave Derek, had consulted with a divorce attorney, and was in the process of seeking a restraining order that would have included Cameron Bailey. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated the murders likely occurred between 4:20 p.m. and 4:40 p.m., with Melissa suffering 27 stab wounds, Faith receiving 15, and little Sarah enduring 12. The report noted that the attack on Melissa appeared to have been frenzied and personal, with several wounds to her face and neck indicating overkill, a term used when the violence exceeds what is necessary to cause death. Blood spatter analysis suggested the attack began in the kitchen, where Melissa was preparing an after-school snack for the girls, with evidence that she had attempted to flee toward the back door before being overcome. The girls were found in the living room, with Faith's body positioned in a way that suggested she had been trying to protect her younger sister, a detail that would later bring jurors to tears when presented in court. Kansas City police arrested Cameron Bailey on February 25, 2022, charging her with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest shocked the community, with news outlets running headlines questioning how a grandmother could perpetrate such violence against her own family. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, citing the particularly heinous nature of the crimes and the vulnerability of the child victims. Cameron's court-appointed attorney, Douglas Howard, immediately began constructing a defense based on his client's age and lack of physical strength, arguing it would have been impossible for a 78-year-old woman to overpower a 32-year-old and 2 children, even with the element of surprise. Public interest in the case exploded as details emerged about Cameron's background. She had been a respected bank manager before retirement, was active in her church, and had no prior criminal record. Friends expressed disbelief, describing her as a devoted grandmother who baked cookies for her granddaughters and attended their school events faithfully. Yet former colleagues painted a different picture, describing Cameron as controlling and manipulative, someone who held grudges and could be vindictive when crossed. One former bank employee told reporters, "She was sweet as pie until you got on her bad side. Then she could make your life miserable in ways that were hard to prove or complain about, always operating just under the radar." As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution built their case around the security camera footage, physical evidence found at the scene, and the powerful motive, Cameron's determination to prevent Melissa from taking her granddaughters away through divorce. The knife used in the attack was discovered in a storm drain 2 blocks from the Mitchell home, with Cameron's fingerprints and DNA on the handle, and traces of all 3 victims' blood on the blade. Cell phone records showed that Cameron had made several calls to Derek in the weeks leading up to the murders, with notably longer calls following Melissa's meetings with her divorce attorney, suggesting Derek may have confided in his mother about the impending separation. Community vigils for Melissa and her daughters drew hundreds of participants, with Melissa's colleagues from Marshall Elementary School establishing a scholarship fund in the family's name. Faith's classmates created a memorial garden at their school, planting perennials that would bloom each spring in remembrance. The case became a lightning rod for discussions about family violence and the often overlooked potential for elder perpetrators, challenging stereotypes about who could commit violent crimes. As the trial date approached, national media descended on Kansas City, with Court TV announcing plans for gavel-to-gavel coverage of what was being called the grandmother murder trial. The Kansas City courthouse stood stoic against the gray February sky as pre-trial hearings for the state of Missouri versus Cameron Bailey commenced exactly 1 year after the murders. Courthouse security implemented heightened measures, anticipating the emotional intensity the proceedings would bring to a community still reeling from the brutal killings. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Eleanor Winters presided with a firm hand, her reputation for running efficient, by-the-book proceedings making her well-suited for a case that promised intense media scrutiny and public emotion. The prosecution team, led by veteran prosecutor Sarah Richardson, arrived with 12 boxes of evidence and a clear strategy focused on the security camera footage that would become the linchpin of their case against the elderly defendant. Defense attorney Douglas Howard entered alongside his client, Cameron Bailey, who shuffled into court using a walker, a recent development that many observers suspected was a tactical decision to emphasize her frailty to potential jurors. The state intends to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant, despite her age and grandmotherly appearance, methodically planned and executed the murders of Melissa Rycroft and her 2 young daughters, Faith and Sarah Mitchell. Richardson stated during the hearing on admissible evidence, her voice steady as she outlined the prosecution's approach. "We will demonstrate that not only did Mrs. Bailey have the means and opportunity to commit these crimes, but she had a powerful motive, preventing her daughter-in-law from divorcing her son and obtaining a restraining order that would have limited Mrs. Bailey's access to her granddaughters." The courtroom remained silent as Richardson continued, describing how the state would present evidence of increasing hostility between Cameron and Melissa in the months leading up to the murders, including witness testimony from friends, family members, and neighbors who had observed their deteriorating relationship. Judge Winters listened attentively, occasionally making notes, her expression giving no indication of her thoughts on the prosecution's planned approach. Douglas Howard rose slowly for the defense's response, his tall frame and deliberate movements contrasting with Richardson's more energetic presence. "Your Honor, the defense intends to demonstrate that it would have been physically impossible for Mrs. Bailey, a 78-year-old woman with arthritis and diminishing strength, to overpower a healthy 32-year-old woman and inflict the number and severity of wounds described in the medical examiner's report," Howard argued, gesturing toward his client who sat with her head slightly bowed, hands folded in her lap. "Furthermore, we will present evidence that someone else had both motive and opportunity to commit these terrible crimes, and that the prosecution has rushed to judgment against Mrs. Bailey based on circumstantial evidence and ageist assumptions about her character and capabilities." This statement caused a stir in the gallery, with several members of Melissa's family audibly gasping, one of her sisters shaking her head in visible disgust at the defense's strategy. One of the most contentious issues during the pretrial hearings involved the admissibility of text messages between Melissa and her sister, Jane Rycroft, in which Melissa expressed fear of her mother-in-law, writing just 3 weeks before her death. "Cameron cornered me in the kitchen yesterday when Derek wasn't home, telling me I would regret trying to take her girls away from the family. The way she looked at me gave me chills. I've never seen such hatred in someone's eyes." The defense fought vigorously to exclude these messages as hearsay, while the prosecution argued they fell under the state of mind exception, demonstrating Melissa's fear and the escalating tensions in the household. After lengthy arguments from both sides, Judge Winters ruled the messages admissible, stating they provided critical context for understanding the family dynamics preceding the murders, a decision that visibly frustrated the defense team. Another key pre-trial battle centered around the murder weapon, a chef's knife from the Mitchell kitchen that had been found in a storm drain 2 blocks from the house, wrapped in a blood-soaked dish towel also from the Mitchell home. The defense moved to suppress this evidence, claiming the chain of custody had been compromised when a rookie officer initially mishandled the collection of the knife, failing to properly document its position before removal. The prosecution countered with testimony from the evidence technician who had supervised the collection, explaining that while protocol hadn't been perfectly followed, the integrity of the evidence remained intact, with clear photographs showing the knife's position before retrieval and immediate proper bagging once the supervisor intervened. Judge Winters ultimately denied the motion to suppress, ruling that any procedural irregularities went to the weight of the evidence rather than its admissibility, another significant victory for the prosecution. The issue of Cameron's mental competency became a central focus during the third day of pretrial hearings, when the defense introduced a geriatric psychiatrist who testified that the defendant showed early signs of cognitive decline consistent with the beginning stages of dementia. Dr. Marcus Whitman stated that while Cameron could understand the charges against her and assist in her defense, her capacity to have formed the specific intent necessary for first-degree murder might be compromised by these cognitive changes. The prosecution immediately requested, and was granted, permission for their own expert to examine Cameron, resulting in contradictory testimony from forensic psychiatrist Dr. Elena Vasquez, who found no significant cognitive impairment. Mrs. Bailey demonstrates excellent recall of events, appropriate emotional responses to questions about her family, and strategic thinking during our evaluation sessions, Dr. Vasquez testified, adding that any memory lapses appeared selective rather than pathological in nature. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the pretrial proceedings came when Derek Mitchell was called to testify about his mother's relationship with his wife. Visibly thin and subdued, Derek entered the courtroom without making eye contact with his mother, taking the witness stand with a heaviness that suggested the immense emotional burden he carried. "Melissa and my mother had a complicated relationship from the beginning," he testified, his voice barely above a whisper at times. "Mom always thought no one was good enough for me, but it got worse after the girls were born. She would criticize Melissa's parenting, show up unannounced to check on the girls, and undermine Melissa's rules when she thought I wasn't paying attention." As Derek continued his testimony, Cameron's expression hardened, her previous appearance of fragility giving way to flashes of anger that several jurors later admitted they had noticed. The prosecution methodically built their timeline during these hearings, presenting evidence that would later form the backbone of their case. Cameron Bailey was captured on the neighbor's security camera arriving at the Mitchell home at 4:05 p.m. on February 23, 2022. Melissa's fitness tracker showed her arriving home with the children at 4:15 p.m., consistent with her routine of picking the girls up from school and after-school care. Neighbors reported hearing what sounded like arguing from the house around 4:25 p.m., followed by screams that one neighbor, Martin Fletcher, described as the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. Cameron Bailey's call to 911 came at 4:52 p.m., during which she claimed to have just arrived and discovered the bodies, directly contradicting the security footage showing her arrival nearly 50 minutes earlier. The defense team worked to establish alternative theories during cross-examination of the state's witnesses, suggesting the possibility of a home invasion gone wrong, or even implicating Derek himself, noting that his construction site was only a 15-minute drive from the house. Detective Mitchell firmly refuted these theories during his testimony, pointing out that nothing had been stolen from the home, there were no signs of forced entry, and Derek's alibi had been verified through multiple sources, including time-stamped photos of him at the construction site taken by the project manager at 4:30 p.m. to document progress. When the defense suggested that Cameron lacked the strength to commit such violent acts, the detective countered that adrenaline and rage could provide elderly individuals with surprising strength, adding that the prosecution would present expert testimony on this phenomenon. As the pretrial hearings concluded, Judge Winters ruled on several motions regarding admissible evidence and established strict guidelines for media coverage of the trial, prohibiting cameras in the courtroom, but allowing sketch artists and reporters to attend. The jury selection process was scheduled to begin the following week, with the prosecution and defense each submitting their lists of questions for potential jurors. Richardson's list focused heavily on potential jurors' experiences with family conflict, their beliefs about elderly individuals' capacity for violence, and whether they could impose the death penalty on an elderly defendant if the evidence warranted it. Howard's questions centered around jurors' ability to presume innocence despite media coverage, their understanding of circumstantial versus direct evidence, and whether they harbored any biases about mother-in-law relationships that might color their perception of the case. The community remained deeply divided as the trial approached, with some expressing sympathy for Cameron based solely on her age and appearance, while others, particularly those who had known Melissa and the children, demanded justice regardless of the defendant's age. Local pastors called for calm and compassion for all affected families, recognizing the unique tragedy of a case where both the alleged perpetrator and victims were from the same family. Derek Mitchell's position remained perhaps the most heart-wrenching. Having lost his wife and daughters apparently at the hands of his own mother, he was observed sitting alone during court recesses, approached by neither the prosecution nor defense teams, a man stranded between impossible loyalties. Media coverage intensified as jury selection began, with national news programs featuring segments on the case and legal analysts debating the strength of the prosecution's evidence versus the challenge of convincing a jury to convict an elderly grandmother. Court TV positioned their temporary studio across from the courthouse, broadcasting daily updates and hosting panels of experts discussing the psychological aspects of the case. The question that seemed to captivate public interest most was not whether Cameron Bailey had committed the murders, the evidence pointing to her guilt was substantial, but how a woman who had led a seemingly normal life for 78 years could suddenly commit such a horrific act of violence against her own family members. As the final pre-trial hearing concluded, Judge Winters addressed both legal teams directly. This case will undoubtedly evoke strong emotions, but this courtroom demands factual evidence and logical arguments, not appeals to sympathy or prejudice from either side. Her words set the tone for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in Kansas City history, a case that would challenge assumptions about family violence and force the community to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those we would least suspect. The trial of Cameron Bailey was scheduled to begin on March 7, 2022, with the prosecution announcing they were fully prepared to present their case against the grandmother who stood accused of one of the most shocking family massacres in recent memory. The morning of March 7, 2022, brought a biting chill to Kansas City as spectators lined up before dawn outside the courthouse, hoping to secure one of the limited public seats for the opening of Missouri versus Bailey. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with subdued tension as the 12 jurors and 4 alternates filed in, their faces solemn with the weight of responsibility they now carried. Judge Eleanor Winters began the proceedings promptly at 9 a.m., her voice clear and authoritative as she instructed the jurors on their duties and the presumption of innocence that must guide their consideration of evidence. Cameron Bailey sat at the defense table, dressed in a modest navy blue dress with a white cardigan, her silver hair neatly styled, looking every bit the stereotypical grandmother, an image her defense team clearly hoped would resonate with the jury. Derek Mitchell sat in the front row behind the prosecution, his face a mask of grief, flanked by Melissa's parents who had traveled from Ohio to attend every day of the trial that would determine justice for their daughter and granddaughters. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about a woman who refused to let go. Prosecutor Sarah Richardson began her opening statement, standing directly before the jury box, making eye contact with each member as she spoke. The evidence will show that the defendant, Cameron Bailey, a 78-year-old retired bank manager, a woman with no prior criminal history, a woman who baked cookies and attended church, made a deliberate choice to end 3 innocent lives rather than accept her daughter-in-law's decision to divorce her son. Richardson's voice remained steady as she methodically outlined the timeline the prosecution would establish, emphasizing the security camera footage that would become central to their case. You will see with your own eyes Cameron Bailey arriving at 4:05 p.m. at her son's home, 10 minutes before Melissa Rycroft returned with her daughters from school, and you will hear the 911 call made at 4:52 p.m. in which the defendant claims to have just discovered the bodies, a lie that began her cover-up attempt. Richardson guided the jury through what they would learn in the coming days, describing how the prosecution would establish motive through text messages, emails, and witness testimony showing Cameron's growing hostility toward Melissa. You will hear from Derek Mitchell himself how his mother increasingly interfered in his marriage, how she belittled and undermined Melissa, and how she became enraged when she learned of the impending divorce and restraining order that would limit her access to Faith and Sarah. As Richardson detailed the forensic evidence, the murder weapon bearing Cameron's fingerprints and DNA, blood spatter analysis indicating she was present during the attacks, and the medical examiner's findings showing the extreme brutality of the stabbings, several jurors visibly winced. The state does not take lightly the charging of a 78-year-old woman with capital murder, nor our decision to seek the death penalty, Richardson concluded, her tone grave. But the evidence will show that age did not temper the defendant's capacity for premeditated violence, nor should it shield her from justice for Melissa, Faith, and Sarah, whose lives were taken with calculated cruelty. Defense attorney Douglas Howard approached the jury with a measured pace, his opening statement beginning with a moment of acknowledgement. The murders of Melissa, Faith, and Sarah Mitchell represent a tragedy beyond words, and nothing said in this courtroom can diminish the horror of their loss or the grief their family continues to endure, he stated, his voice resonant in the hushed courtroom. However, adding another tragedy, the wrongful conviction of an innocent woman, will not bring justice to this family or this community. Howard methodically challenged the prosecution's timeline, suggesting that while Cameron may have arrived at the home earlier than she initially stated to police, this discrepancy came from the shock and trauma of discovering her family members murdered, not from guilt. The prosecution would have you believe that a 78-year-old woman with arthritis in both hands, standing 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing 130 pounds, overpowered a healthy 32-year-old and inflicted nearly 60 stab wounds across 3 victims in a matter of minutes, Howard said incredulously, gesturing toward his client, who appeared frail beside him. Howard continued by introducing the defense's alternative theory that an unknown intruder had committed the murders, possibly someone connected to the construction site where Derek worked, who knew the family's schedule and was aware Melissa would be home alone with the children that afternoon. The prosecution has tunnel vision, focusing solely on Mrs. Bailey while ignoring other viable suspects and explanations that fit the evidence, he argued, promising to present expert testimony, challenging the blood spatter analysis, and questioning whether the knife found in the storm drain was actually the murder weapon. Ladies and gentlemen, when this trial concludes, you will be left with reasonable doubt, not just a sliver, but substantial doubt, about Mrs. Bailey's involvement in these terrible crimes. As Howard returned to the defense table, Cameron reached for his arm in apparent gratitude, a gesture that seemed calculated to reinforce her grandmotherly image to the jury. Judge Winters instructed the prosecution to call their first witness, and Detective Mason Mitchell took the stand, his 15 years of homicide investigation experience evident in his composed professional demeanor. I arrived at 542 Maple Street at approximately 5:10 p.m. on February 23, 2022, responding to a 911 call reporting multiple homicides, he testified, describing the scene he encountered. The defendant, Cameron Bailey, was sitting on the front porch with a patrol officer while the bodies of Melissa, Faith, and Sarah Mitchell were inside the residence. Richardson guided Detective Mitchell through his initial observations and interview with Cameron, playing his body camera footage for the jury, who watched intently as the recorded Cameron calmly described finding her family murdered. What immediately struck me as unusual was Mrs. Bailey's affect. Her emotional response seemed inappropriate for someone who had just discovered her family members brutally murdered, the detective testified, explaining that his suspicions grew when Cameron provided detailed information about the position of the bodies and the nature of the wounds before he had described these details to her. The detective's testimony continued with his description of the crime scene, supported by carefully edited photographs that showed the layout of the home and evidence markers without displaying the victims' bodies. The kitchen showed signs of the initial attack, with blood spatter patterns indicating Melissa was first assaulted there, likely while preparing an after-school snack, as evidenced by the half-cut apple and children's plates on the counter. The detailed and clinical description nonetheless painted a vivid picture of the violence that had occurred, causing several jurors to look away from the photographs. Based on blood trail analysis, Melissa attempted to flee toward the back door, but was pursued and continued to be stabbed in the hallway before collapsing in the living room, where the children were also attacked, Mitchell explained, his professional demeanor momentarily cracking as he described how Faith's body was found partially covering her younger sisters, suggesting she had tried to protect Sarah. The prosecution then introduced what would become the most damning evidence, the security camera footage from the neighbor's doorbell camera across the street. This camera had a clear view of the Mitchell driveway and front door, Detective Mitchell explained as the video began to play. At 4:05 p.m., we can clearly see the defendant's white Toyota Camry pulling into the driveway, and here at 4:06 p.m., Mrs. Bailey exits the vehicle and approaches the front door with what appears to be a small gift bag. The footage continued, showing no activity until 4:15 p.m. when Melissa's Honda CR-V arrived, with the teacher helping her daughters from the car, the three of them entering the house with no indication of distress or awareness of danger awaiting inside. The next movement we see is at 4:49 p.m. when the defendant exits the house alone, gets into her car, appears to sit there for approximately 3 minutes, then re-enters the house at 4:53 p.m., 1 minute after the 911 call was placed from her cell phone inside the residence. Richardson played the 911 call next, the courtroom falling completely silent as Cameron's voice filled the space. "I need help, please. I just arrived at my son's house and found my daughter-in-law and granddaughters. They're not moving. There's blood everywhere. I think they're dead. Please hurry." The dispatcher asked if she was certain they were deceased, to which Cameron replied, "Yes, I checked. For pulses like they show on TV, there's nothing. Please send someone quick." The clinical detachment in her voice struck many in the courtroom, including several jurors who exchanged glances. Richardson then directed the detective to the discrepancy between Cameron's statement to 911 that she had just arrived and the security footage showing she had been at the house for nearly 45 minutes before the call. During cross-examination, defense attorney Howard challenged Detective Mitchell on various aspects of the investigation. "Detective, isn't it possible that Mrs. Bailey, upon discovering her murdered family members, went into shock, affecting her ability to accurately recall when she arrived at the house?" The detective conceded this was possible, but noted that shock typically creates confusion, not fabrication of an alternate timeline. Howard continued, "And isn't it also possible that someone else could have entered the house between 4:15 and 4:49 p.m. through the back door, which would not be visible on this camera footage?" Detective Mitchell acknowledged this theoretical possibility, but pointed out There were no signs of forced entry at any entrance to the home, and Cameron's presence during the entire time frame when the medical examiner determined the murders occurred made an unknown assailant highly unlikely. As the first day of testimony concluded, the prosecution called the neighbor who owned the doorbell camera, Martin Fletcher, to authenticate the footage and provide context for what he had witnessed that day. I was working from home and heard what sounded like arguing around 4:25, followed by screams so terrifying I nearly called 911 myself, Fletcher testified, visibly shaken even months after the events. But then it got quiet again so quickly, I thought maybe it was the TV or the kids playing. Fletcher explained that he had reviewed his camera footage only after police canvassed the neighborhood asking for security videos, not realizing its significance until detectives pointed out the timeline discrepancy. When I saw that Mrs. Bailey had been there the whole time, I felt sick to my stomach. I keep thinking if I had called 911 when I heard those screams, maybe those little girls. At this point, Fletcher's voice broke, and Judge Winters called for a 15-minute recess to allow the witness to compose himself. The afternoon session continued with testimony from the first responding officers, who described finding Cameron Bailey appearing disoriented on the porch, her right sleeve and pants bearing what later tested positive as blood spatter from the victims. Officer Jessica Ramirez testified that when she asked Cameron if she had touched or moved anything in the house, Cameron had stated she checked for pulses but otherwise hadn't disturbed the scene. However, when I entered the residence, I noted that the kitchen sink was wet and there was a damp dish towel hanging on the oven door handle, suggesting someone had recently washed their hands, Officer Ramirez stated. Crime scene technician Benjamin Chen followed, presenting evidence that luminol testing had revealed blood residue in the kitchen sink drain despite attempts to clean it, with DNA analysis confirming it contained a mixture of all three victims' blood. Judge Winters adjourned court at 4:30 p.m., instructing jurors to avoid media coverage or discussions about the case before the next day's proceedings. As the courtroom emptied, Derek Mitchell sat alone long after others had left, eventually approached by a victim advocate who spoke quietly with him before escorting him out a side entrance to avoid the press gathered outside. Cameron Bailey was led away by corrections officers, her earlier grandmotherly demeanor replaced by a rigid posture and tight expression that several observers later described as coldly composed. The first day had established the prosecution's narrative clearly. Cameron Bailey had been present during the murders, had lied about her timeline, and had attempted to clean up evidence afterward, a damning beginning to a trial that would only grow more disturbing as it progressed. The second day of trial began with the prosecution continuing to build their case through physical evidence, calling Kansas City Police Department's lead forensic analyst, Dr. Vivian Wong, to the stand. Dr. Wong, with 20 years of experience in criminalistics, presented the jury with detailed analysis of blood spatter patterns found throughout the Mitchell home, using laser mapping technology to create a three-dimensional reconstruction of the crime scene. The directionality and distribution of blood spatter on the walls, furniture, and suspects' clothing indicate that the assailant was in close proximity to the victims during the attacks, consistent with a frenzied stabbing motion rather than calculated distanced strikes, she explained, using carefully sanitized digital renderings that conveyed the scientific data without unnecessarily graphic imagery. The prosecution entered into evidence Cameron's clothing from the day of the murders, sealed in clear evidence bags, a light blue cardigan with blood spatter on the right sleeve and beige pants with fine droplets across the thighs. The pattern on these garments is consistent with cast-off blood created when a stabbing instrument is raised and brought down repeatedly during an attack, Dr. Wong testified, indicating how the spatter aligned with the action of right-handed stabbing motions. Defense attorney Howard cross-examined Dr. Wong aggressively, challenging her analysis. Dr. Wong, isn't it possible that these blood patterns on Mrs. Bailey's clothing came from her checking the victims for signs of life, as she stated she did when she found them? The forensic analyst shook her head decisively, pointing to specific spatter patterns. No, Mr. Howard, these particular patterns are inconsistent with transfer staining that would occur from touching already bloodied victims. These are high-velocity spatter patterns that occur only when blood is in motion from an active wound. In other words, during the attack itself. Howard pressed further, asking whether it was possible that Cameron had arrived during or immediately after the attack by an unknown assailant who fled through the back door. While theoretically possible, the blood evidence doesn't support that scenario, Dr. Wong replied. Mrs. Bailey's fingerprints in the victim's blood were found on interior doorknobs, light switches, and the kitchen faucet, suggesting she moved throughout the house after the attacks, and the partial shoe prints in blood matching her size 6 shoes indicate she was present during or immediately after the violence. The prosecution next called Detective Sandra Reyes, who had led the analysis of electronic evidence in the case. Detective Reyes presented text messages and emails recovered from the devices of both Cameron Bailey and Melissa Rycroft, establishing a pattern of increasing hostility. On January 12, 2022, approximately 6 weeks before the murders, the defendant sent a text to her son Derek stating, "That woman is trying to destroy our family. She doesn't appreciate what she has, and someday she'll regret trying to keep my granddaughters from me." Detective Reyes read from the case file. Several more messages followed a similar pattern, with Cameron repeatedly referring to Melissa as "that woman," rather than by name, and expressing anger about Melissa's parenting decisions. The most damning electronic evidence came from an email Cameron sent to a friend 3 days before the murders. Melissa is filing for divorce and trying to get a restraining order against Derek and me. She claims I'm interfering in their marriage. She has no idea what lengths I'll go to for my son and my grandbabies. No court is going to keep me from those girls. During cross-examination, Howard attempted to contextualize the messages, suggesting they represented nothing more than a concerned mother and grandmother venting frustrations rather than actual threats. Detective Reyes, have you never said something in the heat of anger that you didn't literally mean? The detective acknowledged this was common human behavior, but pointed out the consistent pattern and escalation in Cameron's communications. Howard then asked if any messages specifically threatened violence, to which Detective Reyes had to concede there were no explicit threats of physical harm, though the phrase, "what lengths I'll go to," could be interpreted as ominous given subsequent events. This minor victory for the defense was short-lived, however, as the prosecution immediately redirected. Detective Reyes, in your experience investigating domestic homicides, do perpetrators typically send explicit threats documenting their intentions before committing violence? The detective shook her head, explaining, "No, that's quite rare. Most domestic homicides are preceded by escalating controlling behaviors, expressions of ownership over family members, and veiled threats, exactly the pattern we see in Mrs. Bailey's communications." The morning session concluded with testimony from the medical examiner, Dr. James Patel, who provided clinical but nonetheless disturbing details of the victim's injuries. Melissa Rycroft suffered 27 stab wounds, primarily to her torso, neck, and face, with defensive wounds on her forearms and hands indicating she attempted to protect herself from the attack, Dr. Patel testified, referring to diagrams rather than autopsy photos out of consideration for family members present in the courtroom. Faith Mitchell, age 7, sustained 15 stab wounds concentrated in her chest and abdomen, with one defensive wound on her right palm. Sarah Mitchell, age 4, received 12 stab wounds to her torso and back, with no defensive wounds, suggesting she may have been attacked while attempting to hide or flee. Dr. Patel explained that all 3 victims died from exsanguination, blood loss, with Melissa likely surviving several minutes longer than her daughters due to her adult body size and the location of her wounds. Perhaps the most impactful moment of Dr. Patel's testimony came when Prosecutor Richardson asked about the force required to inflict the wounds. Based on the depth of penetration, particularly through bone and cartilage in several instances, the attacker used significant force. However, I must emphasize that adrenaline can provide even elderly individuals with substantial strength during heightened emotional states. The doctor continued, explaining that the angle and depth of the wounds indicated a right-handed attacker of approximately 5 feet to 5 feet 4 inches in height, consistent with Cameron Bailey's 5'2" stature. Additionally, the pattern of wounds, particularly on Melissa Rycroft, suggests what we term overkill, continuing to stab well beyond what would cause death, typically indicating a personal relationship and extreme emotional rage directed at the primary victim. Following lunch recess, the prosecution called their star witness regarding the murder weapon, forensic scientist Dr. Elena Vasquez, who specialized in tool mark and weapon analysis. The knife recovered from the storm drain 2 blocks from the Mitchell residence is a chef's knife from a set identified by Derek Mitchell as belonging to their kitchen, Dr. Vasquez testified, showing the court the murder weapon now sealed in clear evidence packaging. The blade length and width are consistent with the wounds on all 3 victims, and microscopic striations on the victim's wound channels match test cuts made with this specific knife. Dr. Vasquez then addressed the fingerprint and DNA evidence found on the weapon. 3 partial fingerprints recovered from the handle of the knife were identified as belonging to the defendant, Cameron Bailey, with a statistical probability of 1 in 6.8 billion. Additionally, DNA from the handle showed a mixed profile containing the defendant's DNA as the major contributor, with Melissa Rycroft's DNA as a minor contributor, consistent with Melissa having used the knife for food preparation before it was used as a weapon. Howard's cross-examination attempted to undermine this evidence by pointing out that as a frequent visitor who often cooked for the family, Cameron's fingerprints and DNA would naturally be on kitchen implements. Dr. Vasquez conceded this point, but noted, what's significant is not just the presence of Mrs. Bailey's fingerprints, but their orientation on the handle in a grip position, overlaying blood from the victims, indicating she handled the knife during or after the attacks, not merely during previous cooking activities. Howard then questioned the chain of custody for the knife, focusing on the rookie officer who had initially mishandled the evidence collection. Isn't it true, Dr. Vasquez, that Officer Kendall picked up the knife before properly documenting its position, potentially compromising this evidence? Dr. Vasquez acknowledged the procedural error, but explained that photographs had been taken immediately upon her arrival at the scene, and the knife had been properly packaged thereafter, maintaining the integrity of the DNA and fingerprint evidence. The prosecution next called neighbor Janet Collins, whose home shared a backyard fence with the Mitchell residence. I was in my garden that afternoon when I heard Melissa's car pull up, and a few minutes later, shouting from inside their house, Collins testified, visibly uncomfortable with her role in the proceedings. I couldn't make out specific words, but it was definitely Cameron's voice. I recognized it from previous arguments I'd overheard. She has a distinctive way of speaking, kind of clipped and sharp when she's angry. Collins went on to describe hearing screams approximately 10 minutes later, followed by a child's voice crying out, "Grandma, stop!" before everything went quiet. I debated calling the police, but then I didn't hear anything else, and I thought maybe they'd just been having a family disagreement that got heated. Her voice broke as she continued, "I will regret not making that call for the rest of my life." Howard approached this testimony cautiously on cross-examination, careful not to appear insensitive while questioning Collins's certainty. "Mrs. Collins, you testified you couldn't make out specific words from inside the house. Is it possible what you heard as Grandma stop could have been something else, perhaps said to someone else entirely?" Collins considered this before responding firmly, "No, sir. I'm certain of what I heard. Faith had a very distinctive voice, and I'd heard her call Cameron Grandma many times before when they played in the backyard." Howard continued, "And in previous disagreements you mentioned overhearing. Had you ever heard or seen Mrs. Bailey become physically violent?" Collins shook her head. "No, but the arguments had been getting worse in the months before. The last one I overheard about 2 weeks before what happened. Cameron was telling Melissa she'd regret trying to break up the family and that no court would keep her from her granddaughters. It was the tone that frightened me. There was something different about it." The day's final witness was Kansas City police officer Trevor Washington, who had discovered the murder weapon during a systematic search of the surrounding neighborhood. Following standard protocol for evidence recovery in homicide cases, we searched in expanding circles from the crime scene, focusing on potential disposal routes from the Mitchell home, Officer Washington explained. In a storm drain approximately 2 blocks north of the residence, I located a chef's knife wrapped in a blood-soaked kitchen towel, matching the description of items missing from the Mitchell kitchen. Washington described how the storm drain had been partially obstructed by winter debris, making it unlikely the items had been carried there by water flow, indicating intentional placement. The location of the drain was along a direct route between the Mitchell home and Mrs. Bailey's residence, suggesting someone walking or driving that path disposed of the items. The prosecution used this testimony to introduce surveillance footage from a gas station halfway between the Mitchell home and Cameron's residence, showing her white Toyota Camry passing at 4:56 p.m., 4 minutes after her 911 call claimed she had just discovered the bodies. Richardson asked Officer Washington if this timing was consistent with someone making a stop to dispose of evidence before continuing home. Yes, the timing aligns perfectly with someone leaving the Mitchell residence after the 911 call, taking approximately 2 minutes to drive to the storm drain location, stopping briefly to dispose of the weapon, then continuing to the location captured by the gas station camera. This revelation caused visible reaction among the jury members, several making notes as Richardson concluded her questioning. As Judge Winters adjourned court for the day, she reminded jurors again of their obligations to avoid media coverage and discussions about the case. The gallery emptied slowly, spectators whispering among themselves about the mounting evidence against Cameron Bailey. Outside the courthouse, protesters had gathered with signs reading, "Justice for Melissa and her daughters," and "No mercy for monsters, regardless of age." A smaller group of counter-protesters stood across the street with messages questioning whether an elderly woman could receive a fair trial in such an emotionally charged atmosphere. Local news crews captured footage of both groups, with anchors noting that the case had deeply divided the community between those who saw Cameron as a monster hiding behind a grandmotherly facade and those who found it difficult to reconcile her age and appearance with the brutality of the crimes. Day 2 of the trial had significantly strengthened the prosecution's case through physical evidence and witness testimony that directly contradicted Cameron's claims about discovering the bodies, establishing not only her presence during the time of the murders, but her active involvement in the violence itself. The defense appeared increasingly concerned, with Howard and his team huddled in intense discussion long after Cameron had been escorted back to detention. Their strategy of suggesting an alternative perpetrator was becoming less viable, with each piece of evidence placing Cameron at the center of the crime, forcing them to consider shifting focus to the upcoming testimony from Derek Mitchell, the son caught between his murdered family and his accused mother. On the third day of trial, tension in courtroom 4B reached unprecedented levels as Derek Mitchell prepared to testify against his mother. The 34-year-old construction project manager entered, looking visibly diminished, his once athletic frame now gaunt, dark circles shadowing his eyes from months of grief and insomnia. Prosecutor Sarah Richardson approached her witness with careful consideration, aware of his unique and impossible position. "Mr. Mitchell, I know this testimony is extremely difficult, and I want to thank you for being here today," she began gently, establishing rapport before moving to substantive questions. Derek nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the middle distance, deliberately avoiding looking toward either his mother at the defense table or the enlarged family photograph the prosecution had placed on an easel, a Christmas portrait showing him with Melissa, Faith, and Sarah, all smiling in matching sweaters just 2 months before their deaths. Richardson began with background questions, establishing the timeline of Derek's relationship with Melissa, their marriage 8 years prior, and the births of their daughters, with Derek providing soft, minimal responses that nonetheless painted a picture of what had once been a happy family. "Could you describe your mother's relationship with Melissa from the beginning?" Richardson asked, moving to the heart of her examination. Derek shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat before answering. "Mom was difficult from the start. When I brought Melissa home to meet my parents, Mom was polite to her face, but later told me Melissa wasn't family material and that I should keep looking." He explained how his mother had criticized Melissa's teaching career as not ambitious enough and questioned her parenting decisions once the girls were born. "After my dad died 5 years ago, Mom became more involved in our lives, coming over unannounced, rearranging things in our house, giving the girls treats when Melissa had told them no, little boundary violations that created tension." As Derek continued, his voice grew slightly stronger, as if the opportunity to finally speak these truths aloud provided some measure of relief after months of holding them inside. "Melissa tried so hard to maintain a good relationship with my mother for my sake and for the girls. She would invite Mom for Sunday dinners, include her in holiday planning, ask for her recipes, but nothing was ever enough." Richardson directed Derek to the months leading up to the murders, asking about changes he had observed in his mother's behavior. "She became more possessive of me and the girls, referring to them as my grandbabies, and sometimes acting as if Melissa was an outsider in our family rather than their mother and my wife." His voice broke slightly as he continued, "Mom would tell Faith and Sarah stories about when I was little, always emphasizing that she was the best mommy and knew how to raise children properly. It was passive-aggressive criticism of Melissa's parenting." Derek then confirmed what many in the courtroom had been waiting to hear, that Melissa had indeed been planning to file for divorce and had consulted an attorney about obtaining a restraining order that would include Cameron. "Our marriage had been struggling for years, largely because of my failure to set boundaries with my mother and my inability to fully support Melissa when conflicts arose. I knew divorce was a possibility, but I was in denial about how bad things had gotten. I never imagined." Richardson gently redirected Derek when he faltered, asking about his whereabouts on February 23, 2022. "I was overseeing a commercial building renovation downtown, about 15 minutes from our house. I had meetings scheduled all afternoon with subcontractors, and our project photographer was documenting progress for the client." Derek explained that he received a call from police at approximately 5:30 p.m., informing him there had been an incident at his home and he needed to come immediately. "When I arrived and saw all the police cars and the crime scene tape, I knew something terrible had happened, but I couldn't have imagined they wouldn't let me inside, but Detective Mitchell took me to his car and told me." At this point, Derek's composure finally broke, and Judge Winters called for a brief recess to allow the witness to collect himself. When testimony resumed, Richardson shifted to Derek's awareness of his mother's actions on the day of the murders. "Did you know your mother planned to visit your home that afternoon?" Derek shook his head. "No, she didn't mention coming by, though she often dropped in without calling first. Melissa had actually asked her to start texting before visiting because it was disruptive to the girls' after-school routine, but Mom rarely respected that request." Richardson then asked about the knife set in their kitchen, having Derek identify a photograph of the matching set with one knife missing, the murder weapon. "Yes, that's our knife set. Melissa was particular about her kitchen tools because she enjoyed cooking for the family. She would have immediately noticed if one was missing." This testimony undermined any defense suggestion that the knife had been taken by an unknown intruder on a previous occasion, establishing it had likely been grabbed impulsively during the confrontation. As Richardson concluded her direct examination, she asked Derek about changes in his mother since her arrest. "She's never once expressed remorse or even acknowledged what happened," he responded, finally looking directly at Cameron for the first time. "In every jail visit, she talks about her case, her comfort, her needs, never about Melissa or the girls, never about what their loss has done to me or to Melissa's family." This damning characterization of Cameron's self-centeredness visibly affected several jurors, who glanced toward the defendant with newly critical eyes. "The hardest part," Derek continued, his voice now steady with the clarity of painful truth, "is knowing I enabled her behavior for years. By not standing up to her, by making excuses for her treatment of Melissa, I contributed to the situation that ultimately—" He couldn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear to everyone in the courtroom. He carried his own burden of guilt for not protecting his family. Defense attorney Howard approached cross-examination of Derek with evident caution, aware that aggressive questioning could alienate the jury. "Mr. Mitchell, first let me express my sincere condolences for your unimaginable loss," he began, establishing a respectful tone. "In the interests of finding the full truth, I need to ask some difficult questions." Howard focused initially on Derek's work schedule, confirming he was often away from home on construction projects, sometimes working long hours that left Melissa handling most childcare responsibilities. "Would you say your absence created additional stress in your marriage?" Derek considered the question before responding. "Yes, my work schedule was a point of contention, especially as Melissa felt increasingly unsupported with my mother's interference." Howard then asked about other stressors in their marriage beyond Cameron's behavior, and Derek acknowledged financial pressures from their mortgage and the girls' activities, though he maintained his mother's behavior was the primary source of conflict. Howard shifted to a more sensitive area, asking Derek about his mother's physical capabilities. "Mr. Mitchell, given your knowledge of your mother's health issues, her arthritis, her recent knee replacement, her complaints about lack of strength in her hands, did you believe she was physically capable of overpowering your wife and inflicting the injuries described by the medical examiner?" Derek's response was measured but firm. "I would never have thought my mother capable of such violence, emotionally or physically, but the evidence says otherwise. And when I think back to times I saw her angry, there was always a frightening intensity to it. My father used to say Mom had nuclear reactions to minor provocations when something truly upset her." This response provided little help to the defense, instead reinforcing the prosecution's narrative of Cameron's hair-trigger temper and capacity for rage. Howard attempted to establish reasonable doubt by questioning whether Derek knew of anyone who might have had conflicts with Melissa outside the family. "Was your wife involved in any disputes at work, with neighbors, or with parents of her students that might have created enemies?" Derek shook his head decisively. "Melissa was beloved at her school. Parents requested their children be placed in her class. Our neighbors adored her. She organized the block summer picnic every year. She didn't have enemies. She had one persistent problem, and that was my mother's hostility. Howard pressed further, asking if Melissa had ever mentioned feeling threatened by anyone else, to which Derek responded, "The only person she ever expressed fear of was my mother, especially in those final weeks." In his final line of questioning, Howard attempted to suggest that Derek himself might have had motives to want his wife gone, asking about life insurance policies and whether divorce would have financially strained him. The question drew an immediate and vehement objection from Richardson, which Judge Winters sustained, admonishing Howard for the implication without evidentiary basis. Derek, however, insisted on answering despite the sustained objection. "I loved my wife and daughters more than anything in this world. I failed them by not protecting them from the one threat I should have recognized, and I will live with that for the rest of my life. But I would have given my own life in an instant if it could have saved theirs." The raw emotion in his voice silenced the courtroom, and Howard wisely chose to conclude his cross-examination rather than risk further alienating the jury. Following a lunch recess, the prosecution called Emma Rycroft, Melissa's sister, who had traveled from Seattle, to testify. Emma, a psychologist by profession, provided insight into Melissa's growing fears in the weeks before the murders. "Melissa called me on February 10th, less than 2 weeks before she died, extremely upset after a confrontation with Cameron," Emma testified, her professional composure occasionally cracking with emotion. "She told me Cameron had cornered her in the kitchen when Derek wasn't home, standing between her and the door, telling her that if she tried to take the girls away, she would make sure you regret it for whatever short time you have left." Emma explained that Melissa had interpreted this as a direct threat and had accelerated her plans to file for divorce and seek protection. "Melissa texted me on February 21st, 2 days before she was killed, saying she had an appointment with her lawyer on February 24th to file the restraining order paperwork. She wrote, 'I'm terrified of what Cameron might do when she finds out, but I have to protect the girls.' That was the last message I ever received from my sister." Howard's cross-examination attempted to suggest Emma might be embellishing her testimony out of grief and anger, asking if she had any documentation of these conversations beyond her recollection. Emma produced screenshots of the text messages she had described, which had already been entered into evidence through Detective Reyes's earlier testimony on electronic communications. Howard then questioned whether Melissa might have been exaggerating the situation, asking if she had a history of anxiety or catastrophizing. Emma's response was measured but pointed. "My sister was a kindergarten teacher who spent her days managing 25-year-olds simultaneously. She was the most patient, level-headed person I knew. If Melissa said she was afraid, she had legitimate reason to be afraid." This characterization of Melissa further humanized her to the jury while reinforcing the credibility of her expressed fears. The prosecution's final witness of the day was Dr. Marjorie Watkins, a forensic psychologist specializing in family violence. "In my 30 years studying domestic homicide cases, I've identified several risk factors that indicate escalating danger," Dr. Watkins explained. "These include possessive language about family members, boundary violations that increase in frequency, expressions of entitlement to access or control of children, and what we call ownership thinking, the belief that family members are possessions rather than autonomous individuals." Without specifically diagnosing Cameron, whom she had not personally evaluated, Dr. Watkins noted that the documented behaviors, showing up unannounced, rearranging items in the home, undermining parental authority, making veiled threats, were consistent with high-risk patterns that preceded other family violence cases she had studied. Howard objected repeatedly during Dr. Watkins's testimony, arguing she was implicitly diagnosing his client without examination and potentially prejudicing the jury. Judge Winters overruled most objections, noting that Dr. Watkins was speaking about behavioral patterns generally, not offering a clinical diagnosis of the defendant. During cross-examination, Howard challenged Dr. Watkins' findings, suggesting her research might be biased toward finding pathology. "Doctor, isn't it true that many grandmothers show up unannounced, bring treats for grandchildren, and have opinions about parenting without ever becoming violent?" Dr. Watkins nodded, but clarified, "Yes, absolutely. It's not any single behavior, but the pattern, escalation, and context that create risk. The vast majority of interfering mothers-in-law, however annoying, never become violent. But when interference is coupled with possessive language, boundary violations that increase despite requests to stop, and explicit or implicit threats when access might be limited, those combinations raise serious red flags." As the third day of trial concluded, the human toll of the case had been laid bare through Derek Mitchell's testimony. A son forced to acknowledge his mother's role in destroying his family. A husband carrying the weight of having failed to protect his wife and daughters from a threat that lived within their own family circle. Outside the courtroom, media analysts noted the prosecution had effectively established not only the physical evidence of Cameron's guilt, but now the psychological foundation and relational dynamics that led to violence. Legal commentators observed that the defense appeared to be losing ground, with their alternate perpetrator theory undermined by Derek's testimony that Melissa had no enemies outside the family, and their frail elderly woman narrative contradicted by evidence of Cameron's rage-driven capacity for violence. That evening, Court TV's special coverage included interviews with domestic violence experts discussing the often overlooked danger of elder perpetrators and the complex family dynamics that can mask escalating risk. "What makes this case particularly disturbing," noted one expert, "is how Cameron Bailey weaponized her age and grandmotherly status, using it as cover for increasingly controlling and ultimately deadly behavior. Society's reluctance to see elderly women as capable of violence may have contributed to others missing the warning signs." As Kansas City prepared for the fourth day of trial, the community continued to grapple with the shocking reality that the person who had taken 3 innocent lives was not a stranger or a hardened criminal, but a grandmother who had chosen violence rather than accept changes to her family that she could not control. The fourth day of trial began with the prosecution calling their forensic experts to provide scientific analysis of the crime scene and victims' injuries. Dr. Nathan Crawford, the Kansas City Police Department's chief blood spatter analyst, took the stand with 22 years of experience in forensic bloodstain pattern analysis. Using specialized software, Dr. Crawford presented a detailed reconstruction of the attacks, with 3-dimensional models showing the positions of assailant and victims at various points during the fatal encounter. The distribution of blood throughout the Mitchell residence tells a clear, if disturbing, story of how these attacks unfolded, he explained, indicating various pattern types on the digital reconstruction. The initial assault on Melissa Rycroft began in the kitchen, as evidenced by impact spatter on the refrigerator and cabinets consistent with the first several stab wounds being inflicted while she stood near the counter where a partially prepared after-school snack was found. The analyst continued, methodically walking the jury through the sequence of events as revealed by the blood evidence. Melissa then attempted to flee, as shown by transfer stains on the wall of the hallway where she likely braced herself while wounded, and drip patterns indicating she was bleeding heavily as she moved toward the living room. Dr. Crawford's clinical description, nonetheless, painted a vivid picture of Melissa's desperate final moments. In the living room, we found what we term arterial spurting patterns on the east wall, indicating Melissa suffered a wound to a major blood vessel while in that location. The concentration of blood on and around the sofa suggests this is where she finally collapsed and where the majority of her wounds were inflicted. The forensic expert then addressed the children's positions, explaining that Faith appeared to have been attacked next, with blood evidence showing she had moved between her younger sister and the assailant before being stabbed herself. Prosecutor Richardson directed Dr. Crawford to the blood evidence on Cameron Bailey's clothing. The spatter patterns on the defendant's cardigan sleeve and pants are high-velocity impact spatter consistent with being within 18 inches of the victims during the stabbing motions, he explained. Furthermore, we identified what's called cast-off pattern on her right sleeve, which occurs when blood on a weapon is flung off during the backstroke of a stabbing motion. Richardson then asked about Cameron's claim that she got blood on her clothes while checking for pulses. Transfer staining from touching already bloodied victims would present very differently. We would expect smeared patterns rather than the fine droplet spatter observed on Mrs. Bailey's clothing. Additionally, the directionality of the spatter on her garments is consistent with her being in the position of the attacker, not someone who arrived later to check on the victims. During cross-examination, defense attorney Howard attempted to challenge the scientific certainty of blood spatter analysis. Dr. Crawford, isn't it true that blood spatter analysis has come under criticism in recent years for lacking standardization and sometimes leading to incorrect conclusions? The expert acknowledged that, like many forensic disciplines, blood stain pattern analysis had evolved over time, but maintained that the patterns in this case were unambiguous. While some complex cases involve interpretive challenges, Mrs. Bailey's clothing presents textbook examples of spatter patterns consistent with active participation in the stabbing, not post-crime contact with the victims. Howard then questioned whether someone of Cameron's age and physical limitations could have generated the force necessary to create the blood patterns observed, to which Dr. Crawford responded, "The patterns don't require exceptional strength to create. The velocity comes from the arterial pressure and the action of the stabbing motion itself, not necessarily extraordinary force from the perpetrator." Following Dr. Crawford, the prosecution called Dr. Rebecca Chen, the forensic pathologist who had performed the autopsies on all three victims. Using anatomical diagrams rather than graphic photographs, Dr. Chen walked the jury through her findings, her precise, respectful language somehow making the clinical details even more devastating. Melissa Rycroft sustained 27 separate sharp force injuries, primarily to her torso, neck, and face. The fatal wound was a stab to the left side of her neck that severed her carotid artery, though several other wounds would likely have been fatal had she received immediate medical attention. Dr. Chen explained that the depth and angle of the wounds indicated a right-handed attacker of average female height, consistent with Cameron Bailey's physical characteristics. The force required to inflict these injuries was significant but not extraordinary. The human body, particularly when in a state of extreme emotional arousal such as rage, is capable of generating surprising strength regardless of age. Dr. Chen's testimony regarding the children proved even more difficult for many in the courtroom to bear. Faith Mitchell sustained 15 stab wounds, primarily to her chest and abdomen. The pattern and positioning of her injuries, particularly the defensive wound on her right palm, suggest she was facing her attacker and may have attempted to intervene or protect her younger sister. The pathologist paused briefly before continuing, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping to reveal the human impact of examining such young victims. Sarah Mitchell received 12 stab wounds, primarily to her back and side, indicating she was likely turned away from the attacker, possibly attempting to hide or flee. The absence of defensive wounds on Sarah suggests she may have been immobilized by fear or attacked from behind before she could react. Richardson asked Dr. Chen about the sequence of the attacks based on wound patterns. The evidence suggests Melissa was attacked first, with the children likely witnessing the initial assault on their mother before being attacked themselves. Faith's wounds indicate she may have attempted to intervene, while Sarah's suggest she was trying to escape. When asked about time of death, Dr. Chen estimated that all three victims likely died within minutes of each other, between 4:25 p.m. and 4:40 p.m., consistent with neighbor Janet Collins's testimony about hearing screams around 4:25 p.m. followed by silence. Given the severity of their wounds and the lack of medical intervention, death would have occurred relatively quickly, though Melissa may have remained conscious for several minutes after the initial attack, possibly aware of what was happening to her children, but unable to help them due to her own injuries. Howard's cross-examination of Dr. Chen focused on alternative explanations, questioning whether the wounds could have been inflicted by someone other than Cameron. Dr. Chen: could these injuries have been caused by a taller assailant who was perhaps kneeling or bending the thumb? Pathologists considered this before responding. While theoretically possible, the consistency of the angle across multiple wounds on three different victims suggests an attacker of stable height throughout the encounter. It would be unusual for someone to maintain a bent or kneeling position while moving between victims during such a dynamic event. Howard then questioned whether the wounds indicated a level of strength inconsistent with Cameron's age and physical condition, but Dr. Chen reiterated that adrenaline-fueled rage could temporarily override physical limitations. In cases of extreme emotional arousal, I've observed injuries inflicted by perpetrators who, under normal circumstances, would not appear capable of such force. The human body can briefly transcend its usual limitations in states of intense fear or anger. Following the lunch recess, the prosecution shifted focus to the psychological aspects of the crime, calling Dr. Lawrence Phillips, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in geriatric violence, a relatively rare but increasingly recognized field. Contrary to popular perception, violence committed by elderly perpetrators is not as uncommon as many believe, particularly in family settings where long-standing power dynamics are threatened, Dr. Phillips explained. When elderly individuals with controlling personalities face perceived losses of authority or access to family members, particularly grandchildren they feel entitled to, the resulting sense of desperation can trigger violent responses that seem disproportionate to others but make sense within their internal narrative. Richardson asked Dr. Phillips about the concept of annihilation rage he had discussed in his published research. Annihilation rage occurs when an individual perceives a threat not just to their status or relationships but to their fundamental identity and purpose. In cases involving grandparents who have centralized their identity around family authority, the prospect of being legally excluded from their grandchildren's lives through restraining orders or limited visitation can trigger catastrophic thinking, the belief that if they cannot have their expected role, then the family structure itself should cease to exist. While Dr. Phillips carefully noted he had not personally evaluated Cameron Bailey and was not diagnosing her, he explained that the evidence presented in court, including Cameron's possessive language about her granddaughters, her resistance to Melissa's parental authority, and her reaction to the impending divorce and restraining order, aligned with patterns he had observed in other cases of family violence committed by elderly perpetrators. Howard objected strenuously to this testimony, arguing it constituted a backdoor diagnosis of his client without proper evaluation. Judge Winters allowed the testimony, but instructed the jury that Dr. Phillips was speaking about general patterns and not offering a clinical assessment of the defendant specifically. During cross-examination, Howard challenged Dr. Phillips's research methodology, questioning whether his findings represented scientific consensus. Dr. Phillips, isn't it true that there's limited research on elderly perpetrators of violence precisely because such cases are extremely rare? The psychiatrist acknowledged the comparative rarity, but maintained that his research, based on over 200 cases, nationwide over the past decade represented a significant and valid data set. While less common than violence by younger perpetrators, elder-perpetrated family violence follows recognizable patterns that deserve serious attention precisely because they often go unrecognized until tragedy occurs. The prosecution's next witness brought the trial back to the crime scene evidence as forensic technician Layla Washington testified about the murder weapon and other physical evidence recovered. The chef's knife found in the storm drain matched the empty slot in the knife block in the Mitchell kitchen, confirmed both visually and through microscopic comparison of manufacturing marks, Washington explained. When we examined the knife, we found not only the defendant's fingerprints and DNA on the handle, but traces of all three victims' blood on the blade in a pattern consistent with multiple stabbing actions without cleaning between victims. Washington also testified about evidence of attempted cleanup at the scene, noting that luminol testing had revealed blood residue in the kitchen sink, despite efforts to wash it away, and that paper towels found in the kitchen trash contained diluted blood matching Melissa's DNA. As the day's testimony continued, the prosecution called computer forensics expert Kevin Zhang, who had analyzed Cameron's laptop and phone. In the weeks leading up to the murders, we found the defendant conducted several concerning internet searches, Zhang testified, displaying a chronological list of search terms. These included queries such as grandparents' rights in Missouri, how to stop a restraining order, can grandparents visit children if parents say no, and most alarmingly, on February 21st, just 2 days before the murders, how long does someone live after being stabbed? This revelation caused visible reaction among jurors, with several looking directly at Cameron, who maintained her composure, whispering something to her attorney. Zhang also testified that Cameron had visited several news websites featuring stories about family violence in the days before the murders, spending significant time on one article about a custody dispute that ended in tragedy. Howard's cross-examination attempted to contextualize these searches, suggesting they represented a grandmother concerned about losing access to her grandchildren legally rather than planning violence. Mr. Zhang, did you find any searches specifically about how to commit murder or avoid detection? The expert acknowledged he had not found such explicit searches, but noted the progression from legal inquiries to more disturbing content like the stabbing query. Howard then questioned whether the data conclusively proved Cameron herself had conducted these searches, asking if others could have used her devices. Zhang confirmed that while the laptop and phone were password protected with Cameron's standard passwords, he could not definitively prove who was physically typing each search, only that they were conducted on her secured devices. The prosecution's final witness for the day was Dr. Sofia Rodriguez, a trauma psychologist who had been working with Derek Mitchell since shortly after the murders. Dr. Rodriguez testified about the devastating psychological impact of the crimes, not to establish Cameron's guilt, but to provide context for the jury's understanding of the harm caused. Mr. Mitchell is suffering from complex traumatic grief, complicated by the nature of these deaths being caused by his mother. This creates a nearly impossible psychological situation where the person who should be a source of support in his grief is instead the cause of it. Dr. Rodriguez explained that Derek experienced severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including intrusive flashbacks, nightmares, and guilt over not recognizing the danger his mother posed to his family. One of the most difficult aspects for survivors in family homicide cases is the shattered assumption of safety. The recognition that the person they trusted was capable of such violence destroys fundamental beliefs about security and trust. Howard declined to cross-examine Dr. Rodriguez, likely recognizing that challenging testimony about Derek's suffering would only alienate the jury further. As Judge Winters adjourned court for the day, she reminded jurors of their continuing obligation to avoid media coverage and discussions of the case. The gallery emptied slowly, many observers visibly affected by the day's detailed scientific testimony that had painted a comprehensive picture of the final moments of Melissa, Faith, and Sarah. Outside the courthouse, legal analysts noted that the prosecution had effectively established not only that Cameron Bailey was physically present and actively involved in the murders, but had potentially been contemplating violence in the days leading up to the crimes, as evidenced by her internet searches. That evening, Kansas City news outlets reported on the day's testimony, with one local anchor noting, "Today's expert witnesses systematically dismantled the defense's two main arguments, that Cameron Bailey lacked the physical capability to commit these crimes and that she had no premeditation or motive for violence. The prosecution has methodically built a case that appears increasingly difficult for the defense to counter." As the trial approached its fifth day, public attention focused on whether Cameron Bailey would take the stand in her own defense, a decision that legal experts characterized as high risk, given the substantial evidence already presented against her. The case had become more than a murder trial. It had evolved into an examination of hidden family violence and the devastating consequences when warning signs go unheeded. The fifth day of trial opened with the prosecution preparing to present their final evidence before resting their case. Sarah Richardson called digital forensic specialist Terrence Jackson, who had conducted a comprehensive analysis of communication records between Cameron Bailey, Derek Mitchell, and Melissa Rycroft in the months leading up to the murders. We recovered over 200 text messages between the defendant and her son, discussing Melissa between November 2021 and February 2022, Jackson testified, presenting a carefully curated timeline of the most relevant exchanges. The frequency and tone of these messages showed a clear pattern of escalation, with Mrs. Bailey's language becoming increasingly hostile toward Melissa, particularly after January 15, 2022, when Derek apparently informed his mother about Melissa's consultation with a divorce attorney. The digital trail painted a disturbing picture of Cameron's growing obsession with preventing the divorce and maintaining access to her granddaughters. Jackson displayed several key messages on the courtroom screen, including one from Cameron to Derek on January 28th. "That woman is trying to poison the girls against me. She's always been jealous of our bond. I raised you to be a man who stands up for family, not one who lets his wife destroy everything we've built." Another message from February 10th read, "If she thinks she can keep my grandbabies from me with some ridiculous restraining order, she's sadly mistaken. No piece of paper will keep me from Faith and Sarah. She needs to remember who she's dealing with." Perhaps most chilling was a message sent on February 20th, just 3 days before the murders. "I've given this a lot of thought, and I'm not going to let her take everything from us. Some problems have permanent solutions. Don't worry about anything, Derek. I'll make sure our family stays together one way or another." Richardson asked Jackson to explain the context of this last message, which Derek had apparently never responded to. Based on the surrounding communications, this message was sent shortly after Derek had informed his mother that Melissa had scheduled an appointment with her lawyer for February 24th to finalize divorce paperwork and file for a restraining order that would include Mrs. Bailey. The timing aligned precisely with Cameron's concerning internet searches presented the previous day, suggesting a direct link between learning about the imminent legal actions and contemplating violence. Jackson also presented emails Cameron had sent to a friend, Caroline Weber, in which she described feeling betrayed by Derek for not fighting harder to keep his family together, and stated that sometimes a mother has to step in when her child is too weak to do what needs to be done. Howard's cross-examination attempted to characterize the messages as the venting of a concerned mother rather than genuine threats. "Mr. Jackson, isn't it common for people to use hyperbole in private messages saying things they would never actually do. The digital forensics expert acknowledged this possibility, but noted the progression and specificity of Cameron's messages differed from typical venting. What we observed was not a single emotional outburst, but a consistent pattern of increasingly hostile and controlling language, culminating in statements that, in retrospect, appear to foreshadow violence. Howard then questioned whether the messages conclusively proved intent rather than simple anger, to which Jackson responded, "Digital evidence rarely provides absolute proof of intent, but when combined with subsequent actions, it can reveal a person's state of mind leading up to those actions." Following Jackson's testimony, the prosecution called Caroline Weber, Cameron's friend of over 20 years, who reluctantly took the stand under subpoena. Weber, a retired librarian, approximately Cameron's age, appeared uncomfortable testifying against her friend, but provided crucial context for the relationship dynamics. Cameron always struggled with boundaries when it came to Derek. After her husband died, Derek and his family became her whole world, but she couldn't accept being a supportive presence. She needed to be in control. Weber described how Cameron would call her after conflicts with Melissa, often casting herself as the victim while describing behaviors that Weber recognized as inappropriate interference. I tried to advise her to give the young family space, to respect Melissa as the mother of her granddaughters, but Cameron couldn't see it. She would say things like, "Those are my grandbabies, and I know what's best for them." Richardson asked Weber about conversations in the weeks immediately preceding the murders. Cameron became more agitated than I'd ever seen her when she learned about the divorce and potential restraining order, Weber testified, visibly distressed by the memory. On February 18th, we had coffee, and she told me, "If Melissa thinks she can take my granddaughters away, she has no idea what I'm capable of." It frightened me enough that I asked her directly if she was threatening violence, and she just smiled and said, "I'm too old for prison, Caroline, but I'm not too old to protect what's mine." Weber admitted she had considered calling Derek to warn him, but had ultimately convinced herself Cameron was simply venting. "I've replayed that conversation in my mind every day since the murders, wondering if I could have prevented what happened if I'd taken her words more seriously." During cross-examination, Howard questioned Weber about Cameron's history, asking if she had ever known her friend to be violent in their 20 years of acquaintance. "No, never. Physically violent, but she could be emotionally cutting and would hold grudges for years," Weber replied. She once stopped speaking to a neighbor for 6 months because the woman commented that Faith's haircut looked cuter before Cameron had taken her for a trim without Melissa's knowledge. Howard attempted to suggest Weber might be misremembering or exaggerating her conversations with Cameron due to the horrific outcome, but Weber remained firm. "I wish I were misremembering. I would give anything to have misunderstood. But Cameron said these things, and I failed to recognize the danger behind her words until it was too late." The prosecution next called Dr. Margaret Foster, Melissa Rycroft's therapist, who had been seeing Melissa weekly for 6 months prior to her death. Dr. Foster had been released from confidentiality obligations by Melissa's parents, allowing her to testify about their sessions. Melissa initially came to me for help managing anxiety, which centered primarily around her deteriorating relationship with her mother-in-law and her husband's unwillingness to establish boundaries, Dr. Foster explained. Over time, it became clear that Cameron's behavior had progressed beyond normal in-law tension to what I would characterize as emotional abuse and controlling behavior. The therapist described how Melissa had documented instances of Cameron undermining her parental authority, making disparaging comments about her to the children, and creating situations designed to make Melissa appear unreasonable when she objected. Richardson asked about Melissa's decision to seek divorce and a restraining order. In our session on February 15th, Melissa reported an incident where Cameron had taken Faith from school early without permission, claiming there was a family emergency that turned out to be simply Cameron wanting to take the child shopping, Dr. Foster testified. When confronted, Cameron told Melissa, "I don't need your permission to see my granddaughter. Blood is thicker than your rules." This incident, combined with increasingly hostile confrontations, led Melissa to conclude that legal protection was necessary. Dr. Foster also testified that in their final session on February 21st, Melissa had expressed fear about how Cameron would react to the restraining order. She told me, "I'm afraid of what she might do when she's served with the papers. The way she looked at me last time we argued, it was like she wanted me gone." Howard's cross-examination of Dr. Foster focused on potential alternative explanations for Melissa's anxiety and whether she might have misinterpreted Cameron's intentions. Dr. Foster, did Melissa ever mention any other sources of stress in her life beyond her relationship with Mrs. Bailey? The therapist acknowledged that Melissa had discussed work pressures and financial concerns, but maintained that the persistent and escalating issue in our sessions was Cameron's behavior and Derek's failure to address it. Howard then questioned whether Melissa might have been overly sensitive to criticism from her mother-in-law due to her anxiety condition, to which Dr. Foster responded firmly, "Melissa's perceptions of Cameron's behavior were objectively concerning, corroborated by multiple external sources, including school officials who had documented the unauthorized removal of Faith from school. This wasn't anxiety creating problems. This was a legitimate problematic situation, creating anxiety." As the prosecution prepared to rest their case, they called one final witness, Samantha Norris, Faith's first-grade teacher, who provided heartbreaking testimony about the 7-year-old's last weeks of life. Faith had always been a happy, outgoing child, but in the month before her death, "I noticed concerning changes in her behavior," Norris testified, maintaining her composure despite the difficult subject matter. "She became withdrawn, her schoolwork suffered, and she told me her grandmother and mother were fighting all the time, and that it made her tummy hurt." Norris described an incident 2 weeks before the murders, when Faith had begun crying during class when another student mentioned an upcoming visit from her grandmother. "When I spoke with Faith privately, she told me, 'Grandma Cameron makes Mommy cry. She says mean things when Daddy isn't listening.'" Richardson asked Norris about any interactions she had with Cameron Bailey. "Mrs. Bailey attended the winter concert in December and corrected me when I complimented Melissa on Faith's performance, saying, 'Faith gets her musical talent from our side of the family, not from her mother.'" Norris also confirmed that Cameron had attempted to pick Faith up from school without proper authorization on 2 occasions, becoming confrontational with office staff when asked to follow the school's security protocols. After the second incident, Melissa requested that the school add a specific note to Faith's file that Mrs. Bailey was not authorized for pickup without express permission from Melissa or Derek, which is an unusual step for parents to take regarding grandparents. After Norris's testimony, Sarah Richardson formally rested the state's case, having presented substantial physical evidence, digital communications, expert analysis, and witness testimony establishing Cameron Bailey's motive, opportunity, and actions in the triple homicide. Judge Winters called for a lunch recess before the defense would begin presenting their case, instructing jurors once again to avoid discussions or media coverage related to the trial. As the prosecution team gathered their materials, the methodical construction of their case was evident. They had built a narrative supported by multiple forms of evidence, addressing not only how Cameron Bailey had committed the murders, but why, tracing the escalation of her controlling behavior and hostility toward Melissa to its violent conclusion. During the lunch break, legal analysts on Court TV discussed the prosecution's strategy and effectiveness. What Richardson and her team have done masterfully, noted one former prosecutor, is humanize the victims while simultaneously exposing the defendant's progression from interfering grandmother to murderer. They've left the defense with few viable options besides arguing for a lesser charge based on diminished capacity or momentary passion rather than premeditation. Another analyst observed that the prosecution had effectively neutralized the grandmotherly image defense by showing how Cameron had weaponized that very image, using her status as a grandmother to mask increasingly controlling and ultimately violent behavior. As court reconvened for the afternoon session, all eyes turned to the defense table, where Douglas Howard would begin the challenging task of countering the prosecution's substantial evidence. The strategic question on everyone's mind was whether Cameron Bailey would testify in her own defense, a high-risk decision given the evidence against her, but potentially necessary given the jury's likely desire to hear her explain the damning text messages, internet searches, and physical evidence linking her to the brutal murders of her daughter-in-law and granddaughters. The defense began its case on the afternoon of the fifth day, with attorney Douglas Howard calling Dr. Elliot Simmons, a geriatric neuropsychologist who had evaluated Cameron Bailey while she awaited trial. I conducted a comprehensive neuropsychological assessment of Mrs. Bailey, including cognitive testing, emotional evaluation, and review of her medical history, Dr. Simmons testified, his academic demeanor lending weight to his analysis. My findings indicate early cognitive changes consistent with the beginning stages of frontotemporal dementia, a condition that particularly affects judgment, impulse control, and emotional regulation, while often preserving memory and basic functional abilities. Howard guided Dr. Simmons through an explanation of how such cognitive changes might affect an elderly person's behavior, particularly in high-stress situations where emotional control was required. Patients with early frontotemporal dementia often demonstrate personality changes that family members describe as not like themselves, Dr. Simmons continued, gesturing toward his detailed reports. They may become rigid in their thinking, have difficulty adapting to changes in family dynamics, and most significantly, may experience disinhibition, a reduced ability to control impulses that they would have successfully managed earlier in life. Howard asked whether such a condition could explain a sudden act of violence in someone with no prior history of physical aggression, and Dr. Simmons nodded. In cases of frontotemporal dementia, we sometimes see what we call catastrophic reactions, disproportionate emotional and behavioral responses to perceived threats or changes to important relationships, particularly involving family members central to the patient's identity. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Richardson immediately challenged the timing and thoroughness of Dr. Simmons's evaluation. "Doctor, you first examined Mrs. Bailey 6 months after her arrest. Is that correct?" When he confirmed this timeline, Richardson continued, "And isn't it true that symptoms of dementia could be mimicked or exaggerated by someone facing capital murder charges who has had ample time to research such conditions?" Dr. Simmons acknowledged this possibility, but defended his methodology. "I employed validated assessment tools designed to detect malingering or exaggeration of symptoms, and Mrs. Bailey's pattern of deficits was consistent with organic brain changes rather than fabrication." Richardson then presented records from Cameron's primary care physician showing no concerns about cognitive changes in examinations conducted just weeks before the murders, including a Medicare-required cognitive screening that Cameron had passed without difficulty. Dr. Simmons, if Mrs. Bailey was suffering from cognitive impairment significant enough to cause a catastrophic reaction leading to violence, wouldn't we expect to see some documentation of cognitive changes before the crimes? Richardson asked pointedly. The neuropsychologist conceded that typically some signs would be noticed, though he suggested they might have been subtle enough to miss in routine examinations. Richardson continued, "And isn't it also true that even if we accept your diagnosis, frontotemporal dementia doesn't prevent someone from forming intent or understanding the nature of their actions?" Dr. Simmons reluctantly agreed that patients with early-stage dementia typically retain awareness of their actions, though he maintained that impulse control could be significantly compromised. Following this testimony, Howard called Dr. Victoria Mendez, a forensic pathologist not involved in the case, to challenge aspects of the medical examiner's findings. Based on my review of the autopsy reports and crime scene documentation, I believe there are alternative interpretations of the evidence that haven't been fully considered, Dr. Mendez testified. She suggested that the number and pattern of stab wounds might indicate more than one attacker, or at minimum, an attacker with significant physical strength. The depth of penetration in several wounds, particularly those that impacted ribs and sternum, would typically require force beyond what we would expect from an elderly individual with arthritis, even in a state of emotional arousal. Richardson's cross-examination was surgical, focusing on Dr. Mendez's lack of direct involvement in the autopsies and crime scene analysis. "You never examined the victims' bodies yourself, correct?" When Dr. Mendez confirmed this, Richardson continued, "And you've never met the defendant, examined her physical capabilities, or considered the specific kitchen knife used in these attacks, which had an exceptionally sharp blade requiring less force than a duller instrument?" The alternative pathologist had to acknowledge these limitations in her analysis. Richardson then presented peer-reviewed research demonstrating documented cases of elderly individuals exhibiting extraordinary strength during adrenaline-fueled events, effectively neutralizing the defense expert's testimony. The courtroom fell silent when Howard announced his next witness. The defense calls Cameron Bailey. The 78-year-old defendant made her way to the witness stand slowly, using a walker that many observers noted had not been present during her earlier court appearances. Once sworn in, Cameron sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, presenting an image of elderly dignity that contrasted sharply with the brutal crimes she was accused of committing. Howard began by establishing Cameron's background, her 40-year career in banking, her community involvement, her role as a mother to Derek and grandmother to Faith and Sarah. "Mrs. Bailey, had you ever been arrested or charged with any crime before these allegations?" Howard asked. "Never," Cameron responded firmly, her voice stronger than her physical appearance might suggest. "I've lived a law-abiding life dedicated to my family and community." Howard carefully guided Cameron through her version of events on February 23, 2022. "I went to Derek and Melissa's house that afternoon to drop off cookies I'd baked for the girls and to talk to Melissa about some concerns I had," she testified, her voice steady. "When I arrived, no one was home yet, so I used my key to wait inside. I left the cookies on the counter and sat in the living room." According to Cameron's testimony, when Melissa arrived with the girls, an argument quickly developed after Cameron brought up her concerns about Melissa's plans to take the girls away from the family. "Melissa became very angry, telling me I had no right to be in her house without permission, and that soon I wouldn't be allowed to see Faith and Sarah at all because of the restraining order she was filing. The girls started crying, and Faith asked what was happening. That's when Melissa told them, 'Grandma won't be visiting anymore because she doesn't respect Mommy's rules.'" Cameron claimed that the situation escalated when Melissa took a knife from the block to continue preparing the girls' snack. She was cutting an apple, waving the knife around while she yelled at me to leave. I was trying to explain that we should discuss this calmly for the girls' sake, but she became more agitated. In Cameron's version of events, Melissa threatened her with the knife, telling her to get out and never come back. I grabbed her wrist to protect myself and we struggled, the knife. I don't remember exactly what happened next. There was so much confusion, the girls were screaming, and suddenly there was blood everywhere. Cameron's voice cracked for the first time as she continued, "I think I blacked out. When I became aware again, I saw what had happened, and I panicked. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I washed my hands because they were covered in blood, and I just needed time to think about what to do." Howard asked why she had initially lied about when she arrived at the house. "I was in shock," Cameron answered, a tear finally escaping despite her composed demeanor. "I knew how it would look, me being there when it happened. I thought no one would believe it was self-defense or an accident. So I left and came back, thinking I could say, I just found them that way." When Howard asked about the knife found in the storm drain, Cameron claimed she had wrapped it in a towel and disposed of it while in a state of panic. "I wasn't thinking clearly, I just wanted the horrible thing gone." Throughout her testimony, Cameron never directly admitted to killing her granddaughters, leaving that part of the timeline conspicuously vague while focusing on the initial struggle with Melissa. Howard concluded his direct examination by asking Cameron about her feelings toward Melissa and her granddaughters. "I love those girls more than anything in this world," she responded, her composure finally breaking as tears streamed down her face. "I would never intentionally hurt them, never. What happened with Melissa was a terrible accident during a struggle. And after that, I don't remember clearly. It's like a nightmare I can't fully recall." This selective memory, combined with her calm demeanor throughout most of her testimony, created a stark disconnect that was not lost on the jury, several of whom watched her with openly skeptical expressions. Prosecutor Richardson approached cross-examination methodically, her tone matter-of-fact rather than confrontational. "Mrs. Bailey, you testified that you blacked out during portions of the incident, yet you remember specific details about washing blood from your hands and deciding to dispose of the murder weapon. Is that correct?" Cameron shifted uncomfortably before responding that her memory was spotty about the sequence of events. Richardson then walked through the timeline established by security footage, phone records, and witness testimony, repeatedly highlighting inconsistencies in Cameron's account. If this was truly self-defense against Melissa, as you claim, how do you explain Faith's defensive wounds indicating she tried to protect her sister? How do you explain Sarah's wounds, which were primarily to her back, as she tried to run away? Richardson's questioning grew more pointed as she addressed the digital evidence. "Mrs. Bailey, how do you explain your internet search for how long does someone live after being stabbed 2 days before these killings?" Cameron claimed she had been researching a crime novel her book club was reading, but Richardson immediately countered with evidence that no such book had been discussed in the group's recent meetings. "And what about your text message to Derek stating some problems have permanent solutions and that you would make sure our family stays together one way or another? Were those also innocent statements taken out of context?" Cameron's response that she had been referring to legal solutions and family therapy was met with visible disbelief from several jurors. The cross-examination reached its climax when Richardson displayed the autopsy diagrams showing the children's wounds. "Mrs. Bailey, I want you to explain to this jury how Faith and Sarah sustained a combined 27 stab wounds during what you characterize as a struggle over a knife with their mother." Cameron's composure finally shattered completely, her face contorting with emotion that, for the first time, appeared genuine rather than performed. "I don't remember. I told you I don't remember what happened after Melissa and I struggled with the knife. It all became a blur." Richardson pressed further. "Did you blur through stabbing your 7-year-old granddaughter 15 times? Did you blur through pursuing your 4-year-old granddaughter as she tried to run away, stabbing her 12 times in the back?" At this point, Howard objected to the prosecutor's tone, but Judge Winters overruled, allowing Richardson to continue. "Mrs. Bailey, you testified earlier that you loved your granddaughters more than anything in the world. If that's true, how could you possibly not remember taking their lives? Cameron's response was barely audible. I never meant for the girls to be hurt. It was Melissa I was angry with. She was taking them away from me. This admission that her anger had been directed specifically at Melissa contradicted her earlier testimony about a mutual struggle and self-defense, a discrepancy that Richardson immediately highlighted. So you now acknowledge you were angry with Melissa, not defending yourself from her? In the final moments of cross-examination, Richardson returned to Cameron's actions after the killings. After stabbing Melissa, Faith, and Sarah multiple times, you had the presence of mind to wash the blood from your hands, wrap the murder weapon in a towel, dispose of it in a storm drain 2 blocks away, drive home, and then return to discover the bodies and call 911, all while creating a false timeline to establish your innocence. These are not the actions of someone who blacked out or was in shock, Mrs. Bailey. These are the calculated actions of someone who knew exactly what she had done and was attempting to escape responsibility. When Cameron had no response, Richardson concluded, "No further questions, Your Honor." Following Cameron's testimony, Howard called 2 character witnesses, Cameron's former co-worker from the bank and her pastor, who testified to her previously unblemished reputation and involvement in community service. Neither witness, however, had significant contact with Cameron in the months leading up to the murders, limiting the impact of their testimony. The defense's final witness was Dr. Raymond Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in dissociative states and memory fragmentation during traumatic events. It's entirely possible for an individual to experience partial amnesia surrounding actions taken during extreme emotional states, particularly if those actions conflict dramatically with their self-image, Dr. Foster testified, providing a potential explanation for Cameron's claimed memory gaps. The mind sometimes protects itself from unbearable knowledge through compartmentalization or dissociation. Richardson's cross-examination of Dr. Foster focused on the convenience of Cameron's selective memory. Doctor, in your experience, is it common for individuals to forget the traumatic actions they've committed while perfectly remembering details that might exonerate them or explain away their guilt? Dr. Foster acknowledged that selective amnesia that aligned with legal defenses was indeed suspicious, though he maintained that memory impairment following trauma could manifest in unpredictable ways. Richardson then asked, "In your professional opinion, is it more likely that Mrs. Bailey genuinely cannot remember stabbing her granddaughters 27 times combined, or that she is unwilling to admit this horrific truth to the jury?" The psychiatrist's hesitation before responding spoke volumes. "I cannot speak to Mrs. Bailey's specific internal state, but generally, when memory gaps align perfectly with the most incriminating aspects of an event while preserving potentially exculpatory details, clinical skepticism is warranted." After Dr. Foster stepped down, Howard announced that the defense rested its case. Judge Winters instructed both legal teams to prepare for closing arguments the following morning, adjourning court for the day. As spectators filed out of the courtroom, the contrast between the prosecution's methodical, evidence-based case and the defense's reliance on Cameron's problematic testimony was stark. Legal analysts immediately began dissecting Cameron's performance on the stand, with one court TV commentator noting, "Bailey's testimony likely did more harm than good for her defense. Her selective memory, combined with the damning admission that her anger was directed at Melissa for taking away her granddaughters, undermined the self-defense narrative while reinforcing the prosecution's theory of motive." That evening, news coverage focused on Cameron's demeanor during testimony, with body language experts suggesting her composed presentation throughout most of her testimony, punctuated by emotional outbursts at strategically appropriate moments, appeared calculated rather than genuine. What was particularly telling, remarked one analyst, was that Bailey showed more visible emotion when describing her own predicament than when discussing the deaths of her granddaughters. This emotional disconnection from the victims, combined with her focus on how Melissa was taking the girls away from her, inadvertently reinforced the prosecution's characterization of her as someone who viewed family members as possessions rather than individuals with autonomy. As Kansas City prepared for the final day of testimony in this tragic case, the community remained divided in its response. While the evidence against Cameron seemed overwhelming to most observers, some still struggled to reconcile the image of an elderly grandmother with the brutal violence she was accused of committing. This disconnection between the cultural archetype of the loving grandmother and the reality of an individual capable of rage-driven violence had been at the heart of the case from the beginning, challenging assumptions about who could commit such crimes and forcing a reckoning with the reality that family violence can come from unexpected sources. The final day of trial began with the courtroom at capacity, additional spectators gathered in an overflow room with video feed, and media representatives positioned to capture every moment of the closing arguments. Judge Eleanor Winters began the proceedings by instructing the jury on the law, explaining the elements of first-degree murder that the prosecution needed to prove beyond reasonable doubt. That Cameron Bailey caused the deaths of Melissa, Faith, and Sarah, that she did so knowingly, and that she did so after deliberation, defined as cool reflection upon the matter for any length of time, no matter how brief. The judge also instructed the jury on the lesser-included offense of second-degree murder, which would apply if they found Cameron acted knowingly but without deliberation, as well as voluntary manslaughter, which would apply if they found she acted under the influence of sudden passion arising from adequate cause. These instructions provided the legal framework through which the jury would evaluate the evidence presented over the previous 5 days. Prosecutor Sarah Richardson approached the jury for her closing argument, her demeanor serious and focused. "Ladies and gentlemen, when this trial began, I promised to show you evidence that Cameron Bailey, a 78-year-old retired bank manager, made a deliberate choice to end 3 innocent lives, rather than accept her daughter-in-law's decision to divorce her son and obtain a restraining order," she began, standing directly before the jury box. "Over the past week, the state has fulfilled that promise through physical evidence, expert testimony, digital communications, and eyewitness accounts, all pointing to the same inescapable conclusion. Cameron Bailey murdered Melissa Rycroft and her 2 young daughters, Faith and Sarah, in a premeditated act of possessive rage." Richardson methodically summarized the prosecution's case, using a timeline displayed on a large screen to walk the jury through the sequence of events on February 23, 2022. "Let's review what we know with certainty," Richardson continued, pointing to key moments on the timeline. "We know from security camera footage that Cameron arrived at the Mitchell home at 4:05 p.m., 10 minutes before Melissa returned with the children from school. We know from neighbor Janet Collins that arguments and then screams were heard around 4:25 p.m., followed by a child's voice crying, 'Grandma, stop!' We know from forensic evidence that all 3 victims died between 4:25 p.m. and 4:40 p.m. from multiple stab wounds inflicted with a kitchen knife bearing Cameron's fingerprints and DNA. We know from blood spatter analysis that Cameron was present during the stabbings, not after, as evidenced by the high-velocity blood spatter on her clothing. And we know that Cameron attempted to cover up her crimes by washing blood from her hands, disposing of the murder weapon in a storm drain, and fabricating a false timeline when she called 911 at 4:52 p.m., claiming to have just discovered the bodies. Richardson then addressed motive, directing the jury's attention to the text messages and internet searches presented during trial. Cameron's own words reveal her state of mind in the weeks leading up to these murders. She told her friend Caroline Weber, "If Melissa thinks she can take my granddaughters away, she has no idea what I'm capable of." She searched online for "How long does someone live after being stabbed?" just 2 days before the murders. She sent a message to her son saying some problems have permanent solutions and that she would make sure our family stays together one way or another. These are not the words of someone who accidentally killed in self-defense. These are the words of someone contemplating and then executing a plan to eliminate what she perceived as a threat to her control over her family. The prosecutor then directly addressed Cameron's testimony, highlighting its inconsistencies and convenient memory gaps. Mrs. Bailey would have you believe that she blacked out and can't remember stabbing Faith and Sarah, yet she remembers specific details that might excuse or explain away her guilt. She remembers washing blood from her hands, wrapping the knife, disposing of it in a specific location, and creating a false narrative for police, all clear indicators of consciousness of guilt. What she claims not to remember is the act of stabbing her granddaughters 27 times combined, an omission that defies credibility and insults your intelligence as jurors. Richardson moved closer to the jury, her voice lowering slightly for emphasis. Perhaps the most revealing moment of this entire trial came during cross-examination, when Mrs. Bailey finally admitted what this case has always been about. "It was Melissa I was angry with. She was taking them away from me." Not that Melissa was threatening her with a knife, as she initially claimed, but that Melissa was exercising her right as a mother to protect her children from a toxic influence. Cameron Bailey's own words expose her true motive. She viewed her granddaughters as possessions that Melissa was taking away, rather than children Melissa was protecting, and she decided that if she couldn't have access to them, no one would. Addressing the defense's arguments directly, Richardson systematically dismantled each alternative explanation offered. The defense has suggested that Mrs. Bailey lacked the physical capability to inflict these wounds, yet multiple experts testified that adrenaline-fueled rage can provide elderly individuals with surprising strength. They've suggested early-stage dementia affected her judgment, yet her calculated actions before and after the murders demonstrate clear, strategic thinking. They've claimed self-defense, yet the evidence shows Melissa was attacked from behind. Faith had defensive wounds consistent with trying to protect her sister, and Sarah was stabbed 12 times in the back while attempting to flee. There is no scenario consistent with the physical evidence in which these killings were accidental, defensive, or the result of a mutual struggle. Richardson concluded by reminding the jury of the lives lost, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. Melissa Rycroft was 32 years old, a kindergarten teacher who dedicated her life to children. Faith Mitchell was 7, a bright, creative first grader who tried to protect her little sister in her final moments. Sarah Mitchell was 4, a preschooler who will never celebrate another birthday, never start kindergarten, never grow up. They died terrified, betrayed by someone who should have loved and protected them, someone who chose to end their lives rather than respect boundaries and legal processes. Richardson paused, making eye contact with each juror. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. It permits only one verdict, painful though it may be. Guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, justice demands nothing less. Defense attorney Douglas Howard approached the jury with measured steps, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case has been emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Nothing I say is meant to diminish the tragedy of losing Melissa, Faith, and Sarah. Their deaths are an immeasurable loss." He paused, allowing this acknowledgement to resonate before continuing. "But our justice system demands more than emotion to convict someone of murder. It demands evidence that establishes guilt beyond reasonable doubt. And despite the prosecution's confident assertions, significant doubts remain in this case." Howard focused first on challenging the prosecution's narrative of premeditation. The state wants you to believe that Mrs. Bailey planned these killings, pointing to text messages and internet searches as evidence of intent. But context matters. The messages the prosecution characterizes as threatening can equally be read as the frustrated venting of a grandmother concerned about losing access to her grandchildren. The internet search about stabbing, while admittedly concerning, occurred in isolation. There were no searches about how to get away with murder, how to clean up crime scenes, or other indicators of someone planning violence. Howard suggested that Cameron's communications reflected emotional distress rather than murderous intent, the desperate expressions of someone seeing her family relationships disintegrating. Addressing the physical evidence, Howard emphasized the limitations and uncertainties in forensic science. Blood spatter analysis, while informative, is not infallible. The patterns on Mrs. Bailey's clothing are consistent with her being present during the stabbings, yes, but also potentially consistent with her intervening in a struggle or coming into contact with the victims immediately after wounds were inflicted. The prosecution has presented their interpretation of this evidence as fact, when multiple interpretations remain possible. Howard reminded the jury of Dr. Victoria Mendez's testimony, questioning whether someone of Cameron's age and physical condition could have inflicted wounds of such depth and force, suggesting reasonable doubt about her capability to commit the crimes as described. Howard then directly addressed Cameron's testimony and admitted memory gaps. The prosecution mocks Mrs. Bailey's partial memory loss as convenient, but traumatic amnesia is a well-documented phenomenon, particularly in cases where individuals commit acts fundamentally incompatible with their self-image. Dr. Foster explained how the mind can compartmentalize traumatic memories as a protection mechanism. Mrs. Bailey's inability to recall exactly what happened after the initial struggle with Melissa isn't a calculated deception. It's a psychological response to overwhelming trauma and horror. This characterization, while acknowledging that something terrible had occurred, attempted to position it as a tragic accident or momentary break rather than premeditated murder. The prosecution asks you to believe that a woman with no history of violence, who lived 78 years as a productive, law-abiding citizen, suddenly transformed into a calculating killer, Howard continued, gesturing toward his elderly client. They ask you to disregard the possibility that cognitive changes associated with aging might have affected her judgment and emotional regulation. They ask you to ignore the context of a family in crisis, with emotions running high on all sides. They ask for certainty where doubt naturally exists. Howard suggested that while something terrible had clearly happened in the Mitchell home, the prosecution had failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that it occurred exactly as they claimed, or with the premeditated intent required for first-degree murder. In his conclusion, Howard appealed to the jury's sense of reasonable doubt. Our system is designed to protect against conviction when uncertainties remain, when alternative explanations exist, when the prosecution's narrative, however compelling, leaves questions unanswered. If you find yourself thinking Mrs. Bailey probably committed these murders as the prosecution claims, remember that probably falls short of the standard required for conviction. Reasonable doubt exists in this case about premeditation, about physical capability, about the exact sequence of events that led to this tragedy. That doubt requires acquittal on the charges of first-degree murder, though you may consider the lesser-included offenses if you believe they better reflect what occurred on that terrible day. Howard returned to his seat beside Cameron, who sat with head slightly bowed, her earlier composure now replaced with an appearance of frailty that seemed calculated to reinforce her defense attorney's portrayal. Prosecutor Richardson's rebuttal was brief but powerful. Mr. Howard speaks of reasonable doubt, but doubt must be reasonable, not manufactured or speculative. The physical evidence in this case tells a clear story. Cameron Bailey arrived before Melissa and the children, waited for them, engaged in a confrontation, and then stabbed Melissa 27 times, Faith 15 times, and Sarah 12 times. She then methodically attempted to cover her tracks. These are not the actions of someone experiencing confusion or acting in self-defense. These are the actions of someone who made a decision and carried it through to its horrific conclusion. Richardson reminded the jury that while Cameron's age and appearance might evoke sympathy, justice required looking past appearances to the evidence, which overwhelmingly supported conviction on all counts. As Richardson concluded her rebuttal, Judge Winters provided final instructions to the jury before they began deliberations. You must consider the evidence dispassionately and apply the law as I have instructed you, regardless of personal feelings about the defendant or the nature of the crimes charged. Your verdict must be unanimous, and you must consider each count separately. The judge then had the bailiff swear in an alternate juror to replace a juror who had become ill overnight, ensuring the full complement of 12 for deliberations. With these final instructions, the jury was escorted to the deliberation room at 11:42 a.m., taking with them the evidence and exhibits they would need to reach their verdict. The Kansas City courthouse fell into a tense waiting pattern as deliberations began, with family members, media, and legal teams anticipating a potentially lengthy process given the complexity of the case and the gravity of the charges. Derek Mitchell sat quietly in a private conference room provided by Victim Services, having chosen not to wait in the courtroom where his mother remained under guard. Melissa's parents and sister gathered in another room, supporting each other through what they hoped would be the final phase of the legal process that had consumed their lives for over a year. Court TV and local news stations set up for extended coverage with legal analysts discussing possible outcomes and the strengths and weaknesses of each side's closing arguments. Contrary to expectations of prolonged deliberations, the bailiff notified Judge Winters at 2:35 p.m., less than 3 hours after the jury had retired, that a verdict had been reached. As word spread through the courthouse, spectators and media representatives rushed back to the courtroom, which quickly filled to capacity. Derek Mitchell was escorted in by a victim advocate, taking his seat in the front row behind the prosecution table, his face a mask of contained emotion. Melissa's family entered together, holding hands as they moved to their reserved seats. Cameron Bailey was brought in from the holding cell, her walker noticeably absent as deputies guided her to the defense table, suggesting the prop had indeed been a tactical choice during her testimony rather than a necessity. Judge Winters called the court to order as the jury filed in, their faces solemn with the weight of their decision. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked the foreperson, a middle-aged high school teacher who had been selected by his peers to speak for the group. "We have, Your Honor," he replied, handing the verdict forms to the bailiff, who delivered them to Judge Winters. The judge reviewed the documents silently, her expression giving no indication of their contents, before returning them to the bailiff to deliver to the clerk for reading. The courtroom fell completely silent, the collective held breath of all present, creating a palpable tension as the clerk stood to read the verdict. In the case of the State of Missouri versus Cameron Bailey, on the count of murder in the first degree of Melissa Rycroft, we the jury find the defendant guilty as charged. A soft gasp went through the courtroom, quickly silenced as the clerk continued. On the count of murder in the first degree of Faith Mitchell, we the jury find the defendant guilty as charged. On the count of murder in the first degree of Sarah Mitchell, we the jury find the defendant guilty as charged. Derek Mitchell closed his eyes, a single tear tracking down his cheek as the full weight of the verdict registered. His mother had been found guilty of murdering his wife and daughters, the official confirmation of the nightmare he had been living for the past year. Judge Winters asked if either side wanted the jury polled, and Howard requested this formality, perhaps hoping for a sign of hesitation from at least one juror. Each juror was asked individually if this was their verdict, and each responded firmly in the affirmative, leaving no doubt about the unanimity of their decision. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the penalty phase of the trial to begin the following day, explaining to them that they would now need to determine whether to recommend the death penalty or life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As the jurors filed out, their expressions remained somber, but resolved, the burden of their decision evident in their bearing. Outside the courthouse, reactions to the verdict were mixed but predominantly supportive of the jury's decision. Melissa's former colleagues from Marshall Elementary School released a joint statement expressing gratitude for the verdict while acknowledging that no outcome could bring back their friend and her daughters. Community members who had followed the case closely gathered on the courthouse steps, some holding candles in memory of the victims, others carrying signs with Melissa, Faith, and Sarah's photos. The case had forced a painful reckoning with assumptions about family violence and who could perpetrate it, challenging the community to recognize that danger could come from those least expected to cause harm. As night fell on Kansas City, the first phase of justice for Melissa, Faith, and Sarah had been completed, but the most difficult decision still lay ahead for the jury, whether Cameron Bailey's actions warranted the ultimate punishment. The penalty phase would bring new testimony focused on aggravating and mitigating factors, forcing jurors to weigh the brutality of the crimes against considerations of age, background, and potential for rehabilitation. For a community and a family torn apart by violence, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but could never restore what had been lost. 3 lives taken by someone who should have cherished and protected them, a betrayal of the most fundamental trust that had forever altered the lives of all who loved them. The penalty phase of Missouri v. Bailey commenced on March 14, 2022, one day after the guilty verdict on all counts. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted subtly. The question of guilt now resolved, attention turned to the appropriate punishment for a 78-year-old grandmother convicted of murdering her daughter-in-law and 2 granddaughters. Judge Eleanor Winters began by instructing the jury on their new task, explaining that they must weigh aggravating factors that might justify the death penalty against mitigating factors that might support a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Your decision must be based on the evidence presented, not on emotion, sympathy, or prejudice for or against either side, the judge emphasized, acknowledging the inherent emotional complexity of capital sentencing while reminding jurors of their duty to remain objective. Prosecutor Sarah Richardson approached the penalty phase with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout the trial, but her tone carried added gravity as she addressed the jury. The state will present evidence of 3 statutory aggravating factors that we believe warrant the death penalty in this case, she began, outlining each factor clearly. First, that these murders were outrageously and wantonly vile, involving torture and depravity of mind. Second, that the murders of Faith and Sarah Mitchell were committed against persons under the age of 12. And third, that multiple murders were committed by the defendant during a single course of conduct. Richardson explained that the prosecution would present additional testimony from the medical examiner regarding the suffering of the victims, impact statements from family members, and evidence of Cameron's lack of remorse to support these aggravating factors. Dr. James Patel returned to the stand to provide more detailed testimony about the victim's final moments, information that had been somewhat limited during the guilt phase to focus on forensic evidence rather than suffering. Based on the pattern and sequence of wounds, Melissa Rycroft would have remained conscious for approximately 3 to 5 minutes after the initial stab wounds, aware of what was happening, but unable to defend herself or her children as she weakened from blood loss. Dr. Patel testified soberly. The children would have been conscious for a shorter period due to their smaller body size, but Faith Mitchell's defensive wounds indicate she was aware and attempting to protect herself and possibly her sister during the attack. This clinical description of the victim's final conscious moments visibly affected several jurors who struggled to maintain their composure as the medical examiner detailed the prolonged nature of the suffering inflicted. The prosecution then called Lisa Rycroft, Melissa's mother, to provide a victim impact statement. Mrs. Rycroft approached the witness stand slowly, clutching a tissue in her hand, her grief evident in every movement. "Melissa was our only child," she began, her voice trembling but determined. "From the day she was born, she brought joy and light into our lives. She chose to become a kindergarten teacher because she believed in nurturing children's potential from the very beginning. Her students adored her, and she spoke of each one as if they were her own." Mrs. Rycroft described how Melissa had balanced her teaching career with motherhood, creating educational activities for Faith and Sarah that were also filled with laughter and creativity. The girls were extensions of their mother's spirit, Faith with her thoughtful nature and love of books, Sarah with her boundless energy and contagious laugh. Mrs. Rycroft continued, describing the devastation of losing not only her daughter, but her granddaughters as well. "We've lost not just our present, but our future. All the birthdays, graduations, weddings, and great-grandchildren we'll never see. Every holiday is now marked by absence instead of joy." She spoke directly about the impact of learning that Cameron Bailey, someone who should have shared their love for Melissa and the girls, had taken their lives. "The betrayal compounds our grief. These precious lives weren't taken by a stranger, but by someone who was supposed to love them, someone who chose violence rather than accept boundaries." Mrs. Rycroft concluded by addressing the defendant directly, though. Cameron kept her gaze downward throughout. "You didn't just take their lives, you robbed an entire community of their gifts. Melissa would have taught hundreds more children over her career. Faith and Sarah would have grown up to contribute their own unique gifts to the world. That future died with them on your knife." The prosecution's final witness for aggravating factors was Detective Mason Mitchell, who testified about Cameron's behavior following her arrest. During my interviews with Mrs. Bailey, she expressed concern about her comfort in detention, her personal belongings, and the impact of the case on her reputation, but never once asked about funeral arrangements for the victims or expressed grief over their deaths, Detective Mitchell explained. When informed that her son was making arrangements for the triple funeral, her response was to ask whether her name would be listed as a surviving family member in the obituary, expressing concern about public perception. This testimony supported the prosecution's contention that Cameron lacked genuine remorse, viewing the consequences of her actions primarily through the lens of their impact on herself rather than the lives she had taken. Defense attorney Douglas Howard began the presentation of mitigating factors with testimony from Dr. Loretta Freeman, a geriatric psychiatrist who had not previously testified during the guilt phase. Advanced age brings unique considerations to sentencing decisions, particularly when considering a punishment that would likely never be carried out due to the natural lifespan remaining, Dr. Freeman explained. She provided statistics showing that the average time between sentencing and execution in Missouri was approximately 15 years, meaning Cameron would likely die of natural causes before any execution could take place, rendering the sentence symbolic rather than practical. Mrs. Bailey has already been diagnosed with early-stage heart failure and the beginning of cognitive decline. Given actuarial tables and her current health status, her life expectancy is approximately 5 to 8 years, regardless of the environment in which she spends those years. Howard then called Reverend Thomas Wilson, Cameron's pastor for the past decade, who testified about her contributions to the church community and potential for redemption. In my visits with Cameron since her arrest, I've witnessed the beginning of reflection and spiritual reckoning, Reverend Wilson stated. While full understanding of her actions may take time, the process of accountability has begun, and the prison environment would provide structure for continued spiritual growth and possibly eventual remorse. The pastor acknowledged that true redemption would require Cameron to fully acknowledge her actions and their impact, something she had not yet done, but suggested that the opportunity for this growth would be better served by life imprisonment than execution. The defense's most significant witness was Margaret Kelly, a retired corrections officer who had supervised the women's geriatric unit at the Missouri Department of Corrections for 15 years before her retirement. Elderly inmates, particularly those with no prior criminal history, typically adjust to incarceration with significant difficulty, Kelly testified. They become targets for exploitation, experience accelerated health decline due to stress and environmental factors, and face substantial challenges accessing appropriate medical care despite legal requirements. Kelly explained that for Cameron, life imprisonment would not be a lenient alternative to death, but would likely involve daily hardships and indignities for whatever time she had remaining. The natural life sentence for a 78-year-old is fundamentally different from the same sentence given to a younger defendant. It represents not decades of potential rehabilitation, but a guarantee that her final years will be spent in an environment designed for punishment, not elder care. In perhaps the most surprising development of the penalty phase, Derek Mitchell requested to address the court, a request Judge Winters granted, after confirming with both legal teams that they had no objections. Derek approached the witness stand, his posture reflecting the impossible weight of his position. A son whose mother had murdered his wife and daughters, now asked to speak to her punishment. "I stand before this court as someone who has lost everything," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "My wife and daughters were my world, and their loss has left a void that can never be filled. I wake each morning to the same realization that they are gone and that the person responsible is my own mother." Derek looked directly at Cameron for the first time since his earlier testimony. "Mom, what you did is unforgivable. You took from me the people I loved most in this world because you couldn't accept that they were not your possessions to control. You betrayed not just Melissa, Faith, and Sarah, but everything a mother and grandmother should represent." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "Despite this, I cannot ask for your death, not because you deserve mercy, but because adding another death to this tragedy serves no purpose. Melissa was a teacher who believed in growth and learning, even from the worst mistakes. She would not want your blood on our hands, even after what you've done." Turning back to the jury, Derek concluded, "I ask you to sentence my mother to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Let her live with the knowledge of what she's done for whatever time she has left. Let her face each day knowing she destroyed not only the lives of Melissa, Faith, and Sarah, but her own son's life as well. Death would be an escape from that reality. Life imprisonment ensures she must face it until her natural end." As Derek returned to his seat, the courtroom remained completely silent, his words hanging in the air, a son's impossible choice to advocate against the death penalty for the mother who had destroyed his family. Following this powerful testimony, both sides presented closing arguments for the penalty phase. Prosecutor Richardson acknowledged Derek's position, but reminded the jury that their decision must be based on the law and evidence, not solely on the wishes of any individual family member. The brutality of these crimes, the vulnerability of two child victims, and the defendant's complete lack of genuine remorse all point to the appropriateness of the death penalty under Missouri law, Richardson argued. While we respect Mr. Mitchell's position, we must also consider justice for Melissa, Faith, and Sarah, whose voices can no longer be heard. Richardson emphasized that the death penalty existed precisely for cases of exceptional cruelty and depravity such as this one, where 3 innocent lives were taken in a premeditated act of possessive rage. Defense attorney Howard built his closing argument around themes of age, diminishing returns of punishment, and the unique position of Derek Mitchell. The loss suffered by the Rycroft and Mitchell families is immeasurable, and no punishment can restore what was taken, Howard began. The question before you is not whether Cameron Bailey deserves severe punishment. The verdict has established that she does. The question is whether executing an elderly woman who will likely die of natural causes before any sentence could be carried out serves the interests of justice or merely satisfies a desire for retribution. Howard reminded jurors that Derek Mitchell, the person most directly affected by these murders, had asked for life imprisonment rather than death, suggesting that his perspective deserved special weight in their deliberations. Judge Winters provided final instructions to the jury regarding the weighing of aggravating and mitigating factors before they retired to deliberate Cameron Bailey's fate at 2:15 p.m. Unlike the guilt-phase deliberations, which had concluded surprisingly quickly, the jury's penalty deliberations extended through the afternoon and into the evening, suggesting the difficult moral calculus they were undertaking. At 7:42 p.m., after more than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury notified the court they had reached a decision on sentencing. As court reconvened, the atmosphere was even more tense than during the verdict announcement, with everyone present acutely aware of the finality of what was about to occur. The jury foreperson stood as Judge Winters asked for their decision. As to count 1, the murder of Melissa Rycroft, we, the jury, having found the defendant guilty, do unanimously find that sufficient aggravating circumstances exist to warrant the imposition of the death penalty. A collective intake of breath could be heard throughout the courtroom as the foreperson continued. As to count 2, the murder of Faith Mitchell, we, the jury, having found the defendant guilty, do unanimously find that sufficient aggravating circumstances exist to warrant the imposition of the death penalty. As to count 3, the murder of Sarah Mitchell, we, the jury, having found the defendant guilty, do unanimously find that sufficient aggravating circumstances exist to warrant the imposition of the death penalty. Derek Mitchell's expression revealed nothing as he heard the jury recommend death for his mother despite his plea for life imprisonment. Cameron Bailey, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout much of the trial, finally showed genuine emotion, not sorrow for her victims or remorse for her actions, but visible fear as she confronted the reality of her sentence. Judge Winters thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them before addressing the defendant directly. Cameron Bailey, you have been found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and the jury has recommended the death penalty on all counts. Before I formally pronounce sentence, you have the right to address the court. Do you wish to make a statement? Cameron rose slowly with the assistance of her attorney, her voice initially faltering but growing stronger as she spoke. I still don't remember everything that happened that day. I never meant for the girls to be hurt. It was just supposed to be Melissa who paid for trying to take them away from me. This admission, more direct than anything she had said during her testimony, caused audible reactions in the courtroom, as she had essentially acknowledged her intent to kill Melissa while attempting to mitigate responsibility for the children's deaths. I don't understand how things went so wrong. Those girls were my flesh and blood. I loved them. Her statement, focusing on her confusion rather than remorse, and continuing to center her own feelings rather than the suffering she had caused, reinforced the jury's assessment of her character and the appropriateness of their sentence. Judge Winters listened impassively before delivering her final judgment. Cameron Bailey, having been found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and the jury having recommended the death penalty on all counts, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you be delivered to the Missouri Department of Corrections, where you will be held until such time as the sentence of death can be carried out in accordance with the laws of this state. The judge set an execution date of March 15, 2023, though all parties understood this was a formality that would be delayed by automatic appeals in capital cases. May God have mercy on your soul, Judge Winters concluded, using the traditional closing phrase that seemed especially weighted in this case of family destruction. As Cameron was led from the courtroom for the final time, Derek Mitchell remained seated, seemingly unable to move as the reality of the proceedings washed over him. Melissa's parents approached him and, in a moment of profound grace, embraced the man caught between his love for his murdered family and the inescapable bond with the mother who had taken them from him. Together they exited the courtroom, united in grief and the long path toward healing that lay ahead. Outside, a crowd had gathered in the March evening, some holding candles in memory of Melissa, Faith, and Sarah, others simply standing in silent witness to the conclusion of a case that had forced their community to confront uncomfortable truths about family violence, elder aggression, and the human capacity for both unspeakable cruelty and remarkable compassion. In the days that followed, Derek Mitchell established a foundation in memory of his wife and daughters focused on identifying and preventing family violence, particularly in situations involving intergenerational conflict. The Melissa Rycroft Memorial Scholarship provided funding for future teachers, while the Faith and Sarah Mitchell Garden at their elementary school became a place of reflection and remembrance. Marshall Elementary School, where Melissa had taught, dedicated their library in her honor, filling it with books that reflected her belief in nurturing children's potential through literacy and imagination. Cameron Bailey's case proceeded through the automatic appeals process, but on November 12, 2024, before any appeals could be completed, she died of heart failure in the medical unit of the Women's Correctional Facility, never having expressed genuine remorse for her crimes. Her death, neither mourned nor celebrated, was noted briefly in local news, a footnote to the tragedy she had authored. Derek Mitchell, informed of his mother's passing, asked only that she be buried without ceremony, her grave marked with only her name and dates, a final severance from the family she had destroyed through her inability to accept the boundaries and autonomy of those she claimed to love. The case of Missouri versus Bailey became a reference point in legal and psychological literature on family violence, elder perpetrators, and the complex dynamics of intergenerational control. The security camera footage that had been crucial to the prosecution's case was later used in training programs for law enforcement and domestic violence prevention, teaching professionals to recognize warning signs that transcend age stereotypes. While nothing could restore the lives lost on that February afternoon in Kansas City, their story continued to protect others by exposing the dangerous reality that violence can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most significant threats hide behind the most benign appearances, a lesson purchased at an unimaginable price by a family destroyed from within.